to raise of hands. To raise of hands, who here has actually heard of the term agroforestry before you ever registered for the conference? Awesome, awesome. So really agroforestry, this comes from the Association for Temperate Agroforestry. It's the intensive land management system. It's an intensive land management system that optimizes the benefits from the interactions created when trees and or shrubs, so our perennials, are deliberately combined with crops and or livestock. So this, it's, you know, when I first started learning about agroforestry, before I went to the first conference in Farmington, I thought, oh, that's turning cows loose on the national forest, right? I came to learn that's not what that is. It has to be kind of that integrated approach. So as we think about it, it's intentional. If you're turning cows loose in the dug fur to go and eat on meadow grass, yes, you have your timber there, but you're not really intentionally managing for those. It's also intensive. It's not, I have some trees or shrubs that happen to be there. And maybe I utilize them, maybe I don't. They're kind of just there. There's kind of an expectation that there's some sort of management to all of these components. And really what we're trying to do, agroforestry really isn't meant to replace all of our cropland. We're not, the goal isn't we're going to turn Iowa into a stand of trees and that's all we're going to have. It's really meant to develop systems that we're getting the largest amount of benefit per land area by using these perennial crops and our other crops and or livestock. Kind of tapping into that synergy that we can get by integrating trees in our production landscapes. They also they're really integrated. So basically, you know, coming back to that multiple benefit, not just kind of focusing on one thing and hoping the rest falls in line, but actually having true integration between our components. So our 5 agroforestry practices are windbreaks. So you guys are hopefully all familiar with these. On-farm windbreaks have a lot of benefits. Not only are we breaking or reducing the wind, but even things like we've seen where windbreaks can be useful in helping control particulates or odors coming from livestock operations. They're also adding biodiversity to our farms. They're also, I mean, great wildlife habitat, right? In some of our large scale intensively managed monocultures, really windbreaks are the corridors for wildlife through these landscapes. Alley cropping is essentially kind of alternating our trees or woody perennials with our other crops and utilizing those. Silvopasture, it's not, so again, this comes back to the intensive part of things. So it's not Hey, I have a cottonwood in my pasture. It's I have a cotton, which I'm trying to convince people in my area that that's not silvopasture. That's just having a tree in your pasture. But maybe there's something that we can plant that we're getting benefit. Maybe that's a dual use tree, or we're actually utilizing those trees for food product or other sort of ag product that we can also get benefit from, maybe reducing, say, heat stress in livestock, something like that. Riparian buffers. Obviously, riparian buffers can serve a lot of important components. I've seen firsthand what happens when we overgraze riparian areas. We tend to utilize those heavily, or at least traditionally had in Utah. And now we've got to the point where we have some of our perennials that have come back, but we're not really utilizing them. So thinking about what we can put in those areas that we can actually utilize as an additional product or outcome of our landscapes. And then forest farming. So we kind of include our food forests in part of this. So if you're not familiar with food forests, it's basically like a multi-level garden where you're replicating what happens in a forest, where you have a canopy, you have mid layers, and then you have your bottom layers, and you're producing potentially usable products at all those levels. You're also changing the microclimate in those areas to not only increase the value of what you're doing, but in some cases you're actually changing it fundamentally to be able to do something that you just couldn't have before. Forest farming, particularly in parts of the eastern US, sometimes they're actually growing medicinals, herbal products, just a ton of different forest products, and they're intentionally not just gathering stuff from a forest, but managing a forest to produce those along with your other benefits. So here's kind of the timeline of SWAN. So as Andy mentioned, our first inaugural meeting was in 2019, and I can say that I was very skeptical going into that until I got to wander around and see what was going on in the landscape and talk to some of these professionals. It's really, really cool stuff. It is kind of weird to be standing in front of people and telling their story, but this is kind of the trajectory we've set. So really our purpose is, a network is to share information, collaborate, being able to bring people in that have specialty and can act as points of contact for not only outreach, but also kind of networking between all of our different projects and being able to integrate what each of us are bringing to the table. And that can include just research, funding, initiatives. We've had some success partnering with external groups in helping their proposals and kind of bringing agroforestry as an approach that we haven't seen much in the Southwest to those external groups. And ultimately, our story is adoption. I would argue that unless some of us can take what we're learning and get that to the people on the ground, we're not going to be successful. We have to be able to increase adoption and see these practices on the landscape. The proof is in the pudding, and that's what we're aiming for. So a few, not advancing. So these are some pictures, I think from Jim through through Mick, of some areas. So this is Havasu Canyon, which is part of the Grand Canyon, and some old relictual orchards that they have in some of those areas, and kind of the microclimate that is created by that area was conducive to having these trees on the landscape. Pretty stark differences when you add some water to a landscape versus not. So as a Utah native, I think of this much like Capitol Reef. These were some early fruit production orchards in southern Utah that are they were practicing silvopasture in these areas. Full scale, large trees, not these grafted semi-dwarf things, and actually utilizing the space in between for forage production. One of the other things that we've done, to give you just a couple examples, the other thing Swan has done is these quarterly webinars. So one of them that Donna was able to cooperate with is Jerome Osentowski, who he's in kind of central Colorado, and he's done a lot of forest gardens. So we were able to present this at our quarterly webinars, and kind of get to see some video of his operations. We were also able to get some folks from Omaha Permaculture to kind of show they are really focused on the urban interface of things. So being able to see what their plans have been and how they've been able to implement permaculture in their communities was really interesting. So I think ultimately, as we go on our field tour and we look around, it seems, as you look outside, it's hard to imagine agroforestry, right? There's no trees. Why is the agroforestry meeting in a place with no trees? But as we drive around, you'll notice we do have trees. They're in certain areas, but ultimately that's one of the biggest things in my mind as a barrier to agroforestry in the arid West is, for one, we already have to be the best at farming. I think it's hard to do here. If you're going to be successful, it's rough. So I think the same goes for agroforestry. I think there are some ways to develop systems. I've seen areas that I think are primed for systems, and they need us. They just need us to be able to implement. So,
hey Steve, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm getting texts that people are only seeing you, they're not seeing the slides. The virtual people.
Oh.
Is there some button?
Well,
Yeah.
that's okay. We don't have our share screen on, but I'm out of time anyway.
Okay.
If anybody wants to see my horrible slides, I will be more than happy to send them to you. If you want to send me an email. But anyway,
So we just
yeah. We've got,
presentation.
well, I've closed it down now, but
We can pull up Rich's.
we can pull up Rich's. I guess
So Steve, we can also post those slides to the Swan site when we distribute the recordings as well. So no worries on that.
Awesome.
So
All right, but we do have the screen share going now. And I see that Rich is highlighted. So when you start that and hand it off to Rich, we should be good to go.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I think we're, ready to go. One thing is the mic should pick us up well, but I tend to walk when I present, and that's not conducive to this.
All right. Thank you, Steve, for a good introduction. And we talked about there may not be a lot of trees. Excuse me. I'm Rich Strait. I'm with the U.S. Forest Service at the National Agroforestry Center in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I've been a part of the Agroforestry Center since 2020. And but just you don't know how excited I am about being here. This is my first time I've traveled for work since the end of February of 2020. They finally let me out. So I'm going to inflict myself upon all of you. So I appreciate getting to see everyone here in the room, and hopefully some of the folks online will be able to meet. What am I doing wrong?
No, we just our share screen. They're not seeing what we're seeing.
Oh, they're seeing the presenter view. You do that and I'll keep talking. How's that? There we go. All right. Thank you, Steve. Appreciate the technological help. So where was I going? So anyway, so I'm happy to be here is what I'm trying to say, and looking forward to getting out on the landscape tomorrow. So Steve mentioned that there are trees on the landscape, maybe not as much as the Pacific Northwest rainforest. And agroforestry, even within the agroforestry community, we've often said that one of the most significant barriers to the adoption of agroforestry is the word agroforestry. Okay, when I first heard it in the 90s, I thought it was a mashup and it was somebody just making this stuff up as they go along. And now I am one, you know. So we at the Agroforestry Center, you may see in some of our publications, if you peruse our website or receive them in the mail, we adopted a long time ago the phrase working trees. And I think that really captures where the trees are in the landscape, where there aren't a lot of trees. Those trees have a role, they have a function. And we try to capitalize on that function of perennial plants on the landscape and all that they do. And they rarely do just one thing. And so when we talk about agroforestry, I think as Steve mentioned, when we talk about the 4 I's, we're really talking about that intentionality of integrating and it's the intensive management to achieve more than one function at a time. So I also stole pictures from Jim Allen. This is one of the pictures he took, because I don't get down in this country very often to take pictures, but there's an example. So this is where we're going to go. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview on the National Agroforestry Center, and then some thoughts about the variety of types of partners and the roles that different partners can play in the advancing the understanding and adoption of agroforestry. Highlight a few things that some existing other working groups are doing. And then I've got some questions for you folks to consider as you meet and dialogue and network while you're here, and hopefully with the folks online as well. So that's the direction we're going. And one of the most significant questions that policymakers and program people ask is, how much agroforestry is out there? And we say, we don't know. So one of the things that some years ago, when Andy Mason, years and years ago, when Andy Mason was the director of the National Agroforestry Center, we managed to get one single question into the national agricultural census, and it was, do you practice silvopasture alley cropping? I think is what it was. And then they do that every 5 years. And then the next time we were able to get a little more comprehensive question, and we found out there were like 30,000 people who answered yes. But then you often wonder, did they understand the question? You know, when you do a very limited survey. So with additional funding from ARS Agricultural Research Service, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the U.S. Forest Service, working with the National Ag Statistics and Survey. We now just completed last month a follow-up survey to a sampling of those folks who responded, yes, they're involved in agroforestry, a much more extensive survey. And so that raw data is going to be data that will be available, and we start processing it here late summer, early fall. And we'll see a number of publications come out from the National Agroforestry Center. We have 2 researchers and a GIS specialist who focus on research. And then we have 3 of us who work on our outreach, education, extension, technology transfer, science delivery, pick a term that you want to use for taking the knowledge that we have, the science that we have at our center and others, large number of other folks who are doing research, and trying to get that into the hands of people who can use that information. So we're working on this to try and get a better handle on how much agroforestry is going on. What are some of the barriers? What are some of the reasons that people engage in agroforestry, to get fill in a little more color into that picture of agroforestry across the United States. So you can be looking forward to that. So I looked at the proposed abstract for this presentation, and I realized, if we had a day and a half, we could do a good job of covering all of those topics. So we're gonna move through some of these pretty quickly, and I'll be here all week to try and answer questions for those of you who are engaged in this meeting. So some of our ongoing research, and I'm going to use this as a way of maybe talking also about some of the opportunities that are out there related to agroforestry. So one of the things, policy. Policy is a big thing that impacts people's decisions, local policies and national policies and state level policies. So we're working on a project with some folks at North Carolina State. They did an initial study on 5 states and looked at the different types of property tax schemes that are out there, and programs that try to encourage certain kinds of behavior or discourage certain kinds of behavior, and how they impact the adoption of agroforestry. So they got the protocol down, and we're working now just to finalize the final details to continue that agreement to look nationwide at all 50 states. And when I think about policies, probably the one big one that is really on the near horizon right now is the Farm Bill. And supposedly, if things go as scheduled, there'll be a 2023 Farm Bill. And right now, there are a large number of groups, organizations who don't know anything about agroforestry, who are trying to influence policies that go into the Farm Bill. And this is a prime time if you want to engage with others who are like-minded in sustainable agriculture, organic agriculture, livestock, well-being. And so working groups such as SWAN could start trying to find some of those groups to engage with, to see if we can influence and integrate or get agroforestry as a part of the Farm Bill, if that's what you'd like to do. Since I am a USDA employee, I'm not telling you that's what you ought to do, because I can't speak to policy. I support the existing policy and thrilled that agroforestry is mentioned in the current Farm Bill, but it's happening quickly, folks. So the Farm Bill will be one place when you're looking at who are some of the other partners who you can join your voice to make it a larger voice, to communicate to your legislators, the people who are on committees and other working groups, like I said, who are also interested in trying to influence what goes into the Farm Bill as far as financial assistance and programs that promote agroforestry. Another research project we're working with, Gary Bentrup and Kate McFarland in our office are working, developing a forest farming calculator. So it's a financial decision-making management tool. It's basically a spreadsheet sort of thing. And they're working with the Appalachian Sustainable Development. But again, once that's developed, it's very easy to take that structure and then adopt it and move it to another location and start looking at other plants and species, some of these non-timber forest species that people harvest. And instead of just wild harvesting, actually, as Steve mentioned, managing for some of these species to reduce pressure on the native populations, and then to make more of those plants and products available to to those who are interested in buying them and processing them. So we're working with those folks. This silvopasture soil carbon, working with Yale University on a project looking at the changes of soil carbon in silvopasture systems as compared to open pastures. And I bring this one up, even though it's there, we're developing the protocols and things, we're interested in looking at other parts of the country. When I think of soil health is another prime topic that you're hearing more and more people interested in. And agroforestry has a lot to offer when it comes to soil health. So I can't tell you the number of webinars and meetings I've gone to where people are talking about soil health and practices to improve soil health. And I get there and they talk about one practice. Does anyone know what that one practice is? Go ahead. This is the interactive part. Excuse me? Compost and cover crops, right? And what happens if you have bad weather and your cover crop doesn't get established? It doesn't do what you want it to do. I'm jealous of cover crops because they get a return on fairly short order. They can have significant impact, but they don't always grow. Integrating perennial crops, trees on that landscape, just like they enhance and protect crops production and quality, they can do the same thing for cover crops. So think about those integrated approaches and that verticality as well. So silvopasture soil carbon, silvopasture fuel loads, fire. I don't need I say more, fire. But looking at the more intensive management and reducing fuel loads and managing those. And as Steve said, it isn't just dumping cows in the woods. When we talk silvopasture, it's much more intensive, moving livestock on a more regular basis. And for the health of the livestock, reducing heat stress, improving forage production and the health of the forage that they're eating by not grazing them down too far so that those root systems continue to grow and flourish. So, and when we talk about silvopasture, we can also think about agroforestry. It's a great way to mitigate or manage, excuse me, what am I thinking about here? I got myself sidetracked, sorry. We're talking about all of the risk that farmers and producers and livestock managers are facing by utilizing perennial crops and trees and shade and reducing wind speed. You're talking about a risk management scheme. And with continuing changing of our weather patterns, more intensive weather systems, be they drought, be they floods, and the windy spring that we've had, we can talk about the value of mitigating and managing risk by having more than one crop, by having the managing and creating a microclimate that's more conducive for crop production and for our livestock. So with that, I need to keep going or I'm going to get the high five from Steve. And I'll just mention one that's not on this list, but urban agriculture is another area that the USDA is really putting some efforts into. They're right now just closing they had new Office of Urban Agriculture and Innovative Production, and they had $1 million worth of grants last year and again this year. And urban agriculture, urban agroforestry, you start thinking about the issues that people are interested in: local food, high quality food. With the price of diesel right now, and I forget the current number of how many thousands of miles the average bite of food travels before you eat it, because we import so much food, but diesel fuel is how we move food. Local food, high quality food, food forests, urban agriculture. More and more people are living in cities, fewer on the rural landscape, and those urban folks are greater and greater interest of where their food comes from. And agroforestry is one of those responsible ways of growing food that supports our larger environment, ecosystem, water quality, soil quality, wildlife habitat, air quality. And it does those things and produces good quality food. So we have 3 urban agroforestry agreements currently, one in Texas, Hawaii, and Maryland. I don't know that we're going to have another one just focused on urban agroforestry. The SIG is an NRCS program, Conservation Innovation Grants, and look into those as possibilities. for trying to do things differently, which is agroforestry as compared to most of our more common and promoted agricultural systems. Work with the climate hubs. Southwest Climate Hub is a supporter of this group, of this meeting, but look at working with the climate hubs. They're a great place of putting information out and also bringing information in. Some of them are being able to support some research. It's a recent NIFA grant that included extension and climate hubs, very large grants that are, I think proposals are due sometime in July. They had another batch that was last year. So SIG, climate hubs. And then we're also currently working with, we put out a number of requests for proposals for the last few years, trying to move from us as a national center, talking about concepts, general ideas. We're getting more and more people asking questions. What does it look like where I live? And by working with a number of groups across the country to develop outreach and educational materials that are specific to, we have some in California, Virginia, Washington, Iowa, Hawaii. What does agroforestry look like, and what are some of the questions that people are asking? So their producer profiles will be some videos, some decision-making tools that we developed. So we'll be putting those on our website and sharing those with folks. Let's see here. I'll mention this. I'm not a big fan of strategic plans and strategic frameworks because they're really hard to do well. However, I suggest that you take a look at the USDA Agroforestry Strategic Framework because it is supported by 8 different USDA agencies, and it helps provide you a framework when you're writing grant proposals, when you're engaging with people and policies. It specifically is a USDA document, legitimizes agroforestry. It gives you an idea of what are some of the research questions and issues that are out there. When you're grant writing, and you can say, and the USDA is striving to do X, Y, Z, that helps give credence to what you're trying to do. So, and it gives you some information. So I need to keep moving here. How much time have I got?
You got
Plenty. I was looking for something a little more specific than plenty, but I'll go with that. So, all right. Oh, lots of time. I got plenty of time. So thinking about partners outside of SWAN, Southwest Agroforestry Action Network, and the different roles that different groups can play. And we've been thinking about this. We've been thinking about what's our national role as a National Agroforestry Center now that more and more people are doing agroforestry apart from us, which is phenomenal. Because when I started, if there was agroforestry going on, our center was either a part of it or knew very much about it, and the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry. And those were the 2 big hubs. Now there are a lot of people doing agroforestry. So there are working groups, there are different associations, there are some nonprofit organizations that are very active in promoting agroforestry, universities and extension. And as Steve mentioned, adoption is a big issue. So let's not forget the farmers, the forest owners, the ranchers and tribes who are on the ground doing agroforestry, and we can learn from them. They can provide the information that we need to share with others from their real life experiences. Extremely valuable partners in improving our understanding of agroforestry and promoting the adoption of agroforestry. So I'm going to try and run through some of these. So when we think about, in no particular order, so universities, I just listed some that I know have some fairly active engagement with agroforestry, and you might know some folks or individuals or programs here in Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Colorado, who are also supporting agroforestry. It's often they don't have an agroforestry program. They don't use the A word in their title. That's okay. But think about sustainable agriculture and organic agriculture. There's a term that is getting tossed around, sustainable intensification. Get your brain wrapped around that. But we're not going to, at some point, I don't know that we can tech our way out of the problems that we're facing when it comes to food and natural resources and increasing populations and changing weather patterns. We need to be more intentional and intensive in the way we manage landscapes that achieve, again, when we do a conservation practice, it must do more than just one thing, hold the soil in place. Well, let's try and get some other benefits from our investment and our time and efforts managing the land. So universities are doing research. They're doing research that's important for their state and their constituents and their extension programs. Again, that's something that you're not going to get from me at the National Agroforestry Center. We're trying to look at what the local and regional folks aren't able to do and get support for. But the universities are a place that you can engage more intentionally and look at answering some of the questions and issues that are important to where you and your constituents live and work, and dare I say, live, work, and play. So universities, they have a role that's very unique that you're not going to see from some other folks. I didn't know what to call this one, so I just said private businesses. Some people call them non-governmental organizations, and that sounded so bureaucratic that I didn't want to use it. There are a lot of different groups, nonprofit organizations. They can have a role that many of us who are in government cannot. They can actively promote policy and engage on policy questions. They can get the ear of state representatives and national congressionals. Writing, or if you're ever in DC, stopping the office and make an appointment, stop in the office and talk. Real people making phone calls and writing letters, not form letters, stopping in, have a large weight in the decision-making of our representatives. That's something that organizations can do. They can also do research, these nonprofit organizations. They can promote and work with assisting producers. For-profit businesses, we mentioned the farmers and ranchers and the forest landowners, woodland owners and tribes who are, they have to make a living, which is great. There's nothing wrong with making money. But there are also consultants out there. And some of those consultants are looking for continuing education credits, but they're also looking to what can I offer people that my competition isn't? And they want to broaden or give a greater breadth of the resources and the information they can provide to the people that they're working with, and they provide assistance. And with the programs like NRCS, they have the technical service providers. So folks get paid for writing conservation management plans. And they say, what plans can I write that maybe others can't? Agroforestry, because there are more and more people interested in how do I generate income in a responsible way that respects the land and the natural resources. And more and more woodland owners are not interested in cutting trees, but they still are required to pay property taxes, and they still have to maintain fences and access lanes and water and septic systems and everything else. These folks also have a stake at trying to make a living, and we can provide work with them. They can also provide information on this is what works and doesn't work, or here are the barriers and here are the issues that the landowners and producers I'm working with are running into. And so we can then take that information, whether it's to research or trying to flesh out the answers to some of those questions. Government agencies, I just threw a bunch here. I mentioned climate hubs earlier. Encourage engagement with the climate hubs. The National Agroforestry Center, we intentionally did not engage in the Southwest US for more than a decade after I got to the Agroforestry Center. Because frankly, one, we were busy and didn't need to make more work that I couldn't get done. And you can't push on a rope. But when we started getting folks like Jim Allen and Andy Mason and Steve Price and a number of other folks and Mick O'Neill who are interested in agroforestry in this part of the world and how can it be done well, and building off of some of the knowledge from indigenous peoples and how they managed and lived on the landscape, we said, all right, there are enough people who are interested that can we support them? And the SWAN is one of the outcomes from that. So talk to the state departments of ag. They set up policies. Local conservation districts. They are often boots on the ground to help deliver the USDA programs. NIFA, the National Institute for Food and Agriculture, is a great source of supporting sustainable ag and organic agriculture and doing things differently than commodity crop production. through their SARE program, the Sustainable Ag Research and Education Program, the AFRI grants, which are, if you've ever done an AFRI grant, they're a huge investment in time, months to develop a good quality AFRI grant, but they are large grants that can, as they say, be transformational in the level and breadth of information that can come out of a well-developed AFRI grant. Ag marketing service, when we think about the whole supply chain, so often in Agriforce, and people, and myself included, think about the biological side of plants and soils and getting established in weather and those sorts of issues. But if somebody's going to grow something, they have to have a place to sell it, right? Or market it. And there's processing. And so ag marketing service is a great resource I don't think we've capitalized on to really help us pull together that whole supply chain. Because if you can't sell it and nobody's going to do agroforestry, and people often ask, so I get interesting questions. I'm sure you do too. They'll say, is maple syrup an agroforestry product? I say, it can be, but you can also do it just a monoculture sort of production system. Corn can be an agroforestry product if it's grown in an agroforestry system approach. So we have to think about how do we market. We got talking last night about third-party certification, like for organic or sustainable forestry. Is there a way we can tell that story of food and livestock that are managed and grown and made available and sold that are in agroforestry systems that are responsible systems? So government agencies can help support that through various programs. And I mentioned the Farm Bill earlier as one place to have influence on how programs are developed and supported. Associations. This is another loosely defined group that I just made up. So the Association for Temperate Agroforestry, AFTA, is a group that's been around for quite a while. And I'm going to assume that those tones are not from me. Okay. So AFTA has been around a long time, and historically AFTA was a lot of research and university folks, but more and more farmers, producers, landowners are interested in AFTA. They hold meetings on the typically odd numbered years. And right now the AFTA leadership is really working hard to try and move that organization, that association, into a direction where it is more strategic and more active in addressing things such as policies and programs and information and coordination across such a diverse landscape of people interested in agroforestry. You can become a member. Its membership is pretty low as far as cost, but they have a newsletter and they have a website, aftaweb.org. Local watershed associations are addressing water, at scale issues that perennial plants that agroforestry provide can help address watershed issues. I mentioned some regional ones here. There's the Northeast Farmer Coalition, and they meet and support each other and share information and trying to engage with different agencies locally in program development. There's a group that started the Beginning Forest Farmer Coalition. That's again more Appalachian. But think about these farm to plate movements and local food or associations and groups and sustainable ag groups. The Society of American Foresters, which is, I know not many folks in this room are probably members, but they have an agroforestry working group. So think about your other agricultural associations that you belong to or other belong to, and how they might be another location and a group to partner with to promote and support agroforestry from a different angle. So when we talk about working groups, Kate McFarland, my colleague, put together this map, and I thought it was so good. I thought, why recreate it? So these working groups have varying degrees of activity going on, but I'm just going to run through briefly. So the Northeast Mid-Atlantic Agroforestry Working Group started up with funding through SARE, and they did a series of in-person training and webinar trainings, and they continue to have I believe a newsletter, and they've had quarterly calls and webinars. So there's a group. So we think regionally, which is what the SWAN is all about, is what are the regional issues? There's a Chesapeake Bay Agroforestry working. This one came about because of basic legislation. The states are all part of a pact, and they're responsible for improving the water. Not this group is per se, but there's the Chesapeake Bay is people responsible for improving the water quality in Chesapeake Bay. So this group meets and tries to promote programs and support the efforts of different agencies, local and regional, to increase the adoption of agroforestry as a part of their suite of tools to address water quality at a larger scale. Silvopasture.ning.org. I think it's silvopasture.ning.org or silvopasture.ning.com. Pardon me, I can't remember. All I know is I can't access it through my federal computer because it is a social networking sort of setup. So for cybersecurity, it's a really interesting site. It's strongly toward the Northeast, but I think more and more people, it's a great place for asking questions and seeing what other people have asked and answers to questions and resources that people have found. It's a great way to network. And as more and more people from with the Western US and say in the Southwest are engaged in these sorts of networking groups, you could really start to share information and find out, oh, I'm not the only one who is interested in how do I, engage in silvopasture and reduce heat stress and improve livestock productivity and those sorts of issues. So there's a Northeast Climate Hub. The Pacific Northwest Agroforestry Working Group started up, and then very similarly, COVID hit. And so they started doing some webinars. And then they've shifted their focus a little bit more toward engaging with tribes and traditional ecological knowledge and how to crosswalk between indigenous land management techniques and methods and knowledge and our USDA programs, and where are there commonalities and where can we find that common language to utilize existing programs to support traditional ways of managing the landscape that are proven that may not have the same type of documentation that we often want to see in USDA, but have within the culture. And so we've been working with folks and I think by July, we're going to have an online, I'm sorry, folks, just lost another term. Story map, there it is in the last line, that's looking at traditional ecological knowledge and agroforestry in the Pacific Northwest. So we did have a listening session that was just the invitees were only tribal representatives and tribal organizations, so they could share information and network and talk to each other on this topic of agroforestry and land management. So there's an approach. The California Agroforestry Network, there was a gentleman who attended the Spokane meeting of the Pacific Northwest, came all the way up, and then used that and engaged with other folks in California that he knew and advertised an idea of a California Agroforestry Working Group, which Southern California has some very common issues with Swan, and a great way to share and network across our perceived boundaries, right? So they're just getting started. The Great Plains Windbreak Initiative. So a number of folks interested in windbreaks protecting livestock and crop communities and soil. And they've just recently decided we need to be talking about more than just windbreaks. So let's talk about other agroforestry practices. And so that's a group that came together with another face-to-face meeting, and now has we meet every other month on a Teams meeting, whether Zoom or Teams, and they share information that we've got this problem, or we're trying to do this, we're addressing this programmatic issue this way. Oh, that we've been running into that. How do we get agroforestry in through this existing USDA program? They've also supported looking at collecting data on utilizing the onboard GIS systems that combines have, and looking at crop yields as the combine moves further away from a windbreak, because nobody's got enough research to research all crops on all soils and weather patterns. And so much has changed since a lot of that research was done in the 60s and 70s. The MidAmerica Agroforestry Working Group was started and really was going strong for a few years, and then it's kind of floundered, I'll be honest with you. And one of the questions I have for you is, how do you keep a group active? And one of the things is to have a goal, a project to focus upon, to draw people in together. People are busy enough, they don't need another meeting. But if it's a meeting that's going to accomplish goals that they're interested in, that a group are interested in advancing, I think that's really key for a group such as SWAN. So here are my questions. I didn't print these out, but I'm sure you can think of other just as good or better questions. But what are some of the goals? Not broad goals. What are some more near horizon goals for this group, and what do you want to get accomplished in the near future? How do we maintain momentum? And I think projects, having a specific project to work on, be it a policy issue or specific training or something along those lines, it's a great way to keep people coming together. What role do you want to see the working group play in those broader suite of collaborators and people working together? What do you want to be known for? And what can you add value to in the natural resources community? And then what can this group do regionally that will benefit maybe other working groups that you can learn from, and then share that knowledge? And yeah, maybe I'll just leave it like that. But I think those are some of the questions that we can be having amongst ourselves here as we take a break. And I'll leave with this. We have publications that are in print from the National Agroforestry Center. We're going to send out a newsletter. It just went to the printer, so that's going to be going out in a paper newsletter. I know we still use paper because some people really still like to have a piece of paper. We also have some information sheets. We have 2 new information sheets that will be printed soon. But we also put out a quarterly digital email. And to sign up for that is that really long URL there. Or if you go to the National Agroforestry Center webpage, scroll clear to the bottom, it says sign up for Agroforestry Connection. And if you're interested in getting on the mailing list or hard copies or that, you can just email me, richard.straight@usda.gov. So with that, Stephen, I'm done, and appreciate all your attention. Sorry, I used up all the time for no questions, but that'll teach me to write a abstract for presentations a little more confined next time. So
Is Will Murray here? Ah, good.
So I haven't met you before, and there's 2 people in the room I didn't know, and I'm glad that one of you was Will.
So close this down. So we're not dealing with that anymore.
So
While we're just in a break here, I just want to make sure that everyone knows you're welcome to join Swan's business meeting on Thursday morning. And we're actually talking about a pretty big thing. We are going to talk about, there's an organization called the Global Evergreen Alliance. And we're going to have a presentation by its executive director, Dennis Garrity.
Not the super tech guy, but he just wants arrows to move forward and back on
We're
the.
going to have a discussion about whether Swan might want to join actually a global alliance around agriculture. We want quite a few organizations, so you might find that interesting just to listen to Dennis. He used to be the director general of the World Agroforestry Center, which is headquartered in Kenya. Really interesting.
Hey, Steve. Hey, Steve,
yes.
can you ask Andy to repeat what he's saying to the audience there?
Sorry.
Here.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, Bev and everybody that's online. I just wanted to say everyone is welcome to join Swan's business meeting on Thursday morning from 9 to 12. And a key thing that we've added to the agenda is Dennis Garrity with the Global Evergreening Alliance is going to talk to us about a collaboration potentially between Swan and this global alliance around agroforestry as a tool to restore degraded landscapes across the globe. So pretty interesting, going to be really interesting. Sorry about that, not talking to the whole group.
Thanks, Bev, Mandy. So our next presenter is Will Murray. He's a resource conservationist with the NRCS in the Monticello Field Office, which is south of where we're at in Moab today. Will started for NRCS in Montana in 2002 as a range conservationist in the Harlowtown and Sheridan Field offices. Most recently, he's worked as a conservationist in Southeast Alaska from 2014 to 2021 as a resource conservationist, and he began working in the Monticello Field office about a year ago. His work in Alaska included helping small communities with sustainable food production and supporting long-term economic growth. He is a 91 graduate of Humboldt State University and has a bachelor's of science in range management with minors in botany and geography. Will's presentation is titled NRCS Assistance with Agroforestry and Forestry Practices in Utah. Thanks, Will.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for having me here, folks. With that introduction, you'll find out well as I talk, but I'm a generalist by trade, not a specialist. The NRCS has provided me with the opportunity to like resource conservationist. What does that mean? I have a background in ag. I grew up on a sheep ranch. Natural resources is my love. Having the range degree, you learn about all the plants, the soils, geology, that kind of stuff. I'm kind of excited about the direction when Rich was talking about the Farm Bill of 2023. There's paradigm shifts going on in the country, in the agencies. DC, I think, is finally starting to get the message. One of those signs, and I believe Rich mentioned as well, is soil health. That's something that's really kind of gaining steam for principles of soil health. It's, you know, getting people to think of things in terms of a system-wide approach. As far as agroforestry, this is one of those places where I think we're about 5 to 10 years behind the soil health approach. So what I'm going to talk about here is kind of some of the traditional things that we've had in the agency. Basically our programs, for those who are not familiar, who and what is the NRCS? Natural Resource Conservation Service used to be, of course, the Soil Conservation Service, came out of the Dust Bowls in the 30s. Hugh Hammond Bennett was a champion of soil health and that sort of a thing, but maintaining the soils. What we do basically at this point is we're assisting agricultural producers get conservation practices on the ground to deal with resource concerns. It's sort of a mouthful, but that's the basic thing. Some of us sometimes, or some of the customers think of us as a store to shop at, get practices on the ground. Our focus as resource conservationists, range conservationists, soil cons, is to get people thinking in terms of systems, putting together conservation plans, things like that. We have cost share programs to where we cost share incentives to get those practices on the ground. Programs are funded through the Farm Bill. as Rich was mentioning. Farm bills come up for appropriation about every 5 to 6 years. It's not quite on a tight schedule. 2018 was the last farm bill, and there's currently right now a farm bill being written, or at least everything being put together to write it. As far as the way we do business, we have a sister agency, the Farm Service Agency, tend to be co-located in our county offices. We're generally located county by county throughout the country. And they handle the business side of what we do. So anyone coming to us for anything other than technical assistance, which is something that we can do, but if you're wanting to sign up for programs, you kind of have to go through the eligibility process with them first. As far as the eligibility process, it's pretty simple. Who is eligible? It can be individual, partnership, or corporation. The big thing to note is units of government, political subdivisions. So city, county, state, federal, we can't be spending money on those things. Having said that, there's a few programs you can work around these things in partnerships or leases or things like that. There's times when outfits like Nature Conservancy comes in and leases out some government land, and we're able to get conservation on the ground because of that partnership and that separation. Qualifying as an agricultural producer, have to have some sort of agricultural operation. And that could be literally growing flowers, fiber, any kind of livestock operation, non-industrial private forestry. In Alaska, that was the native tribes was one of my major clients. I did a lot of forestry with them on doing forestry thinning, pruning projects. Control of the land is kind of is one of the other legs of the eligibility. Deed, lease, or other binding agreements. Typically, most situations are deeded, of course, but there are lease stuff. Down here in Utah, we have just kind of a departure for me coming from Alaska is we have contracts where we're helping people out doing things on BLM ground, but since there's a third party involved that has the lease, things like that. I mentioned that because that opens up the opportunities. I mean, it's
Sorry to interrupt, Will, but I'm getting a text that the PowerPoint is in preview mode, not in full slide mode.
It's a Steve problem.
So someone's got to do that. That's not my.
We can see it, but apparently they're seeing in a preview mode and presented.
Oh, okay.
Okay, got you. That's still,
Bev, you're there?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, do you see the issue or?
Yeah, you've just fixed it. It's now full screen, and as long as you know that works for Will, that's fine.
We've caught it just in time. You didn't miss anything. I'm trying to zip through this stuff. This is kind of the boring stuff, but it's stuff everybody should know. And as far as the last leg of eligibility, adjusted gross income goes off a prior 3-year average yearly income less than 900,000. The idea is we're trying not to help out the really rich, but we're trying to help out regular Joes. But again, there are ways around that as well. As far as the yes. Sure. And that's a good point. Is anybody going to ask questions at any time? I'm not rigid on anything.
Just make sure to reiterate the question so that.
Yes, I fully intend to.
Thanks.
Isn't that part of the bumps in the policy though for agroforestry is that it has to be a commodity crop production?
Yeah, so the question is one of the bumps in the road for application to NRCS programs, the agricultural production? And the answer to that is yes. I'm not sure where this is going to go. I can tell you that with other subjects, this has been gotten around or they figured out ways. Specifically, I'm thinking about high tunnels and urban agriculture, which is one of the things that's going to become a big part, I would imagine, of the 2023 Farm Bill. And so when I was asked to do this presentation, this was one of the things I said, well, you know, this could be a speed bump for lots of people. And so I don't know nationally where this conversation sits. My hope is that this is something that they're trying to incorporate in there to try to make things a little bit, because honestly, let's be honest about the whole thing. Is NRCS's thing isn't as much about agriculture. There's a little more of a drift towards just natural resource and a whole environment approach to things, and which I think is a good thing. But there are those that are fighting that sort of a thing. So I really don't know if there'll be improvements, but that's definitely a speed bump. All right, as far as, and this is what I put down here, we have lots and lots of programs. I just wanted to talk about a few of them where I saw opportunities that could possibly, some of these are better fits than others as far as agroforestry type projects. The main program that we have, the environmental quality incentives program, that's the bread and butter program for my agency. Provides cost share incentives to ag producers to install conservation practices. And within that, there's a lot of latitude. As I said, things have been stretched during the Obama administration, when the high tunnels became a thing that we were asked to incorporate that in what we do. And if you go back to earlier slides where I was saying every practice we put in isn't something from a shopping list per se, it's supposed to be addressing an identified resource concern. It starts to become a stretch if you can imagine a high tunnel greenhouse the size of this room, 600 square feet or something like that. Like, what are we really doing there? And the real thing that's going on there, which I think is fine, it's just not within regular EQIP rules, Farm Bill rules, is it's a food security thing. And so it's really kind of by rule, and it sort of goes to your question is, we're getting a paradigm shift, and hopefully the 2023 Farm Bill reflects more of that shift. But that would probably be the program that most folks, if you were looking to do, on farm kinds of things, a full farm or ranch plan, it goes in the EQIP. CSP, Conservation Stewardship Program, is a program that's set up for those that have already put a lot of conservation on their place. It's a stewardship program trying to help people. It has a yearly payment with some enhancements that people do, where they're taking a system-wide approach that's already working well, and they're trying to bring it up to a new level. This one there are some of the enhancements that when people get a contract, there are some forestry enhancements. So that is an opportunity for someone who has an ag operation. And again, the ag operation can be, it could be a garden. I mean, you could have a gardening business and that sort of a thing. So I guess one of the take homes that I'll just insert in here is that at this moment, the agroforestry, there's a few things that we normally do, windbreak, shelter belts, and other kinds of things like that. But we're at a point now where there's conservation or conversations going on in our state office in terms of how can we address things like agroforestry concerns. And so we sort of fold, spindle, and mutilate on these programs with one little thin rope tied to what the program was designed to do. The RCPP program, Regional Conservation Partnership Program, I'm not too sure. I threw this one in there because this is more of a big, large, tends to fund projects that are, you know, $400,000 up to several $1 million. I had a couple of these projects up in Southeast Alaska that were multiple partners. Nature Conservancy was one, Forest Service, Native tribes. This is one of those places where out of the box thinking. This is.
There have been a couple of RCPPs that are Agriforces related, more in the central part of the US that I know of. So it's definitely one that is accepted.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Rich.
Could you repeat, just tell the online people what Rich just said?
I was just about to, yeah. No, I'm really good about this because my hearing is really poor. So I'm one of these guys that Rich was just merely pointing out that in the middle part of the country, there has been some successes with RCPP program. And so when I was kind of putting this together, I think that currently right now, if there are people thinking about doing some larger kinds of things, I'm not sure if they really want to start seeing applications for $10,000 on projects like that, because there's a fair amount of money in that program. But if you got a place like Moab trying to get together and do some certain thing, and there's quite a few partners, 10 to 20 landowners that are trying to do something, I think that there's an opportunity there to get in and put something together. And I think that there's plenty of funding in this program as one of the take homes. And it can be thought of, and it's kind of like a grant program. It's not, but if you think of it in terms of a grant, so the better the proposal that you put together, the better the odds of getting funded on something like that, especially if it's including lots of partners.
Do the participants in that have to be EQIP eligible?
So the question is, do the participants in RCPP have to be EQIP eligible? And this is where it starts to get into pretty gray region. And I kind of have to say that the answer is no, but there needs to be probably at least one participant that's eligible. Because I can think of some of the partners on what we were doing on Prince of Wales Island up in Southeast Alaska, and there were partners in there that were, I'm not sure they were eligible. I don't, so this is one of those places that it's really, I would say there are sets of rules, but that's a place right there. And the program below it, I think those are places where all you really need to show is there's a need, there's interest, and there's a great benefit. And I'll kind of throw in my thing is that this program and the one below it, the Joint Chiefs, photo ops. If you can imagine a photo op at the end of a project or during getting a smile from Rich, but if you can imagine a good photo opportunity and a story map type presentation, and people standing in front of a camera smiling, then I would say don't let the rules stop you. Put your stuff together. And then, and I think now people understand, and in my agency, we try to, like I said, fold, spindle, mutilate, try to work these things through. If there's eligibility issues, we try to work, there's workarounds for everything, I guess is the point. The final program that I have on here is the Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Initiative. Most people refer to it as just Joint Chiefs. This one here is probably not that applicable for anything except fairly sizable projects. I threw it in simply because, as what I was just saying, it's a place where all rules suspend for our Farm Bill money based on what I've seen. This is one of those things where it's a DC thing, and it's the Joint Chiefs, so the chief of the NRCS, chief of Forest Service, and and then you get partners involved, and the next thing you know, you can get things happening that doesn't seem to be within advertised and printed rules. So that's a place where rules of physics sort of suspend. But I don't know if that would be something that you could get going immediately. I think it needs more paradigm shift. The RCPP program, I think, is something that you could put in an application, right now and get something, and get something through within the next year. EQIP, of course, is the main thing.
Well, the SIG is equip funded, and that's, which stands for, Rich brought it up, Conservation Innovation Grants Program. That's an opportunity for agroforestry, isn't it?
Right, and so Andy's pointing out that the Conservation Innovation Grant, and I did want to hit on that because I didn't get it on here because I wasn't thinking in terms of the grant programs, but money comes out of EQIP for that, those conservation innovation grants, and they're definitely an opportunity, especially since the agroforestry thing it's fairly new, so it falls within that innovation. So if you're putting together an application for that program, the innovation side of it is going to be an easier thing to sell. And there's a better hook there for people. So I'm imagining a well put together, well-written plan and grant application would probably have a good opportunity to get funded. The only question there, and not totally sure of where Utah stands on their funding for that program or that grant program, but I imagine the money it's probably less than 500,000 that's in there in Utah. I don't know that, but like up in Alaska, I think we had less than 300,000 for that. So it's not something that's huge yet, but if it starts to get a lot of interest, drives these kinds of programs. So common forestry practices, I won't spend too much time on this. I'm building off of Steve and Rich. Forest stand improvement, which is the way we're generally doing it in the NRCS, is used to be pre-commercial thinning, but now they call it conservation thinning for stand health, composition, and wildlife habitat. Like up in Alaska, I did a lot of that, tree and shrub pruning, on stands that you're reaching a canopy closure, but you want to maintain understory vegetation. That's one of those places where we apply that practice. Tree and shrub establishment, you're planting trees, to improve plant diversity, wildlife habitat. Riparian forest buffers, tree establishment adjacent to riparian areas, you're providing shade, lowering stream temperatures, restoring plant communities. Let's see. Woody residue treatment, which is reduction of hazardous fuels. This is something that we were doing in Alaska, especially on both of our pruning projects and our thinning projects, produced quite a bit of slash. And so it was important to be able to get in there and reduce the slash down to sizes that were easier to get ground contact and get. Unfortunately, in Southeast Alaska, I will add that because of distance from everything, there was no way to be able to economically collect the slash, use it for biofuels or anything like that. There were some local efforts like that in small communities, to create fuel logs for burning in boilers for schools and things like that. But that's an opportunity that everybody up there is trying to figure out some way to make that work. There's fuel breaks, removal of woody vegetation and debris in a strip, band or block in order to reduce risk of fire. Windbreak shelter belt establishment. This is one of the biggest places where what we've been doing for years could fit into an agroforestry type application. Windbreaks and shelter belts, of course, in like where I was in Montana, it was a big part of a lot of the operations that were out in the open, you know, breaking up the wind, and also to manage your snow deposition, get it to pile where you want it, you know, and provide shelter for livestock. Let's see, forest management stewardship plan. I threw this in for any serious forestry stuff. If it involves like taking down any trees, not all of our forestry practices require a forest management, forest stewardship plan. But if you're doing any conservation thinning, serious pruning, this kind of stuff, we require a development of state-approved forest management plan before we can contract anything else. Our payment on this is actually pretty decent and stuff. I mean, the incentive there is to get people that have non-industrial private forest lands to get that kind of a thing done, so that what we're doing is moving in a direction, conservation direction. Anyway, well, I'll zip through these because I basically just kind of talked about them. I'll give you, this is a little bit of Southeast Alaska. These are my ooh-ah pictures. This is a picture I took from a helicopter and stuff. So feel free to ooh and ah a little bit. This is the on-ground look. Yeah, there we go. Thank you, folks. I needed that. But you can just kind of see what we're dealing with up there. We were going through stands that were around 25 years from a clear-cut harvest. Tree and shrub pruning. This is a before, this is an after. There we go. But what's amazing about this is that this is literally like one season later. And the before, you don't see a lot of that brush and everything. And then the later, you know, got to get my full ooh here. But it was one of my favorite treatments just because it had such a major effect. Up there, there's also traditional use and all that. As far as berry collection, that kind of a thing. Woody residue treatment. This is some of the slash that it was generated. It could be considerable. Down here, not as much of a thing. I've got one project that I talked is over Cedar City and Iron County. They're doing some aspen regeneration type stuff. This is sort of a picture of what's going on where the conifers are coming up and starting to choke out some of the aspen. In normal times, that wouldn't be a problem, but we're losing aspen across the landscape. They're removing the white fir, subalpine fir, decadent dying Douglas fir, and aspen. They're culling trees to about a 15 to 25 foot spacing, which leaves opportunity for, once the stand's reestablished, as far as a silvopasture kind of a situation. Feller and buncher, they're using a skidder and dozer for cleanup. They're piling and burning the slash. They've done 1,000 acres in that county and the surrounding counties in the last 10 years. They're doing about 100 acres a year. Just a few of the photos. Seeing on the right, you're seeing that nice, you know, regen on the aspen. All right, anybody got questions? Yeah.
Just curious what you see as some of the real potential in a place like Monticello for Agriforestry.
Not supposed to ask that question. Come on. So the question is, you know, how do we apply this in a place like Monticello, you know, which goes for all of South, you know, this Four Corners region, shall we say. It's kind of a tough thing. Like this is something I've thought about in my time since being here since June, you know, how to apply these kinds of things. There are opportunities for doing windbreaks and shelter belts. The big limitation is, of course, water. you've got to have water on those plantings that you do, or you're just going to have plantings that croak. You know, so maybe some cleverness in terms of water collection and stuff to be able to have that, or there's just not a lot as far as the flow on wells. Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of answers, you know, give me another year. Yes.
I think an answer of may not be appropriate in this location is perfectly legitimate. I mean, it's not, Agriforestry isn't for every acre. I think no is legitimate in some cases.
Right. And Rich is saying that the answer could be as simple as that there isn't an application. My own, and I 80-something% agree with you, but I was raised on Captain Kirk. I don't believe in the non-winnable situation. I just don't have the answer right now. It's one of these things that it's definitely something that I've been sort of turning in my head and say, how can we get some things on these operations? I mean, lately we've been watching this wind and all the soil in the air and everything blowing, and I'm thinking, you know, there are studies that show that cover crops on all this dryland farm country down towards Monticello and over to Dove Creek where I live. And they're saying the cover crops aren't something that's really even going to help because you have a tough time establishing the cover crops. But it's like there's got to be some answer to how do we keep it from blowing? Because I live in Dove Creek. It's probably my place to the Obajos is 25 to 30 miles. And I have not seen the mountains for most of the last month or two. And those mountains are about 10,000 plus. And yesterday I saw clouds of dirt that were going into the air well over 10,000 feet, easily well over 10,000 feet.
Well, and on that note, I mean, I think history teaches us too, look what was done in the Great Plains during the Dust Bowl and the Prairie States Forestry Project. And maybe those trees didn't take the first time, but there was some incredible work done in those days to stem the loss of soil using trees.
Right. And Andy's making the point of the response, you know, to look at what was done in response to the Dust Bowl era. You know, if at first you don't succeed, try again. I guess it's really kind of the answer. But I guess the take home on any of this is the answers for these kinds of problems aren't simple, but I don't think they're insurmountable. It's just a question of, you know, thinking outside the box and all these other cliches and stuff. But I think it's an egg that can be cracked. So.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm newer to the Agroforestry world, but I have a project up in the south with the aspen regeneration, and it's kind of being modeled after what they're doing in Iron County. But when you're talking about silvopasture, it makes me think about, you know, we're wanting to manage for the aspen, but there's a lot of the landowners, you know, they have cattle, but they also, their primary income is hunting. And so I don't know if that would fit into this question of what's the application of agroforestry here for that higher elevation? Would that count?
Yeah, so the question that's asked is, so I mentioned the project in Iron County, and so a project in the LaSalle's that's aspen regeneration, and the question is whether it would count, whether it was something we could probably help with, and I think the answer is yes. I think it just takes a little bit of imagination as far as how to put it together, how to contract it. I mean, the stuff we're talking about and what you're talking about, where a producer has cattle or livestock of some sort, and then maybe a hunting operation. The best managers of their land are already doing these things and have been, some of them generationally. So sometimes it's, you know, it's this upper elevation kind of stuff where you're getting more moisture, there's more opportunities, but really the success is coming, realizing what your opportunities are, and how to bring resources to bear to make these things happen. And management is the key in this situation. Am I still going, or?
We have a break coming up until quarter after, but if you have a question, want to continue, then that works.
All right, thank you all.
Thanks, Bill.
Hey, Beverly and Steve, we're not
Yes.
getting our questions answered.
I've
You're
been
only
watching.
Denise, I don't see any of your questions in the
Well, I'm doing it in the chat because I can't get the question Q&A to work. It won't open up where I can type. So I've been doing it in the chat. You told me you would monitor the chat.
Yeah, I didn't see questions. I just saw comments.
No, I have a question. It's right there at the bottom of my comment. And it's for Ray.
All right, well, they're on break right now, so Steve can go get him back up, and everything that we're saying is broadcast to the whole group. So as soon as he comes back up, you can ask that question.
Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna hit stop recording and then re-record once the break is over.
West for many generations, especially in such an arid climate. We go to the next slide. There we go. First, I just wanted to do a land acknowledgement of where I'm located, which is near Grants, New Mexico. I'm located in the Pueblo of Laguna, at the base of Mount Taylor. And in this area, it's also ancestral lands to many Pueblo nations, including Acoma, Cochiti, Isleta, Hopi, Jemez, Laguna, Nambe, Oke, Picaries, Powake, Sandia, San Felipe, San Ildefonso, Santa Ana, Santa Clara, Santo Domingo, Taos, Tezuki, Tortugas, Zia, Zuni, and Isleta de Cerro Pueblo, and it's also an ancestral area for Navajo and Rama Navajo tribes. And then I wanted to do a land acknowledgement for where this presentation is being held in Moab, Utah. And this is the ancestral lands of the Ute Indian tribe, the South Ute Indian tribe, and the Ute Mountain Ute tribe. And for those who are interested, I encourage everyone to take a look at Native Land Digital, which provides maps of the United States to see, you can put in your zip code and get an idea of whose ancestral lands you may be residing on. And I think that this is incredibly important because we're talking about acknowledging, the scientific contributions of these tribes in the Southwest and the work that they have to offer for agroforestry and for edible landscaping. So currently, I want to share what's going on in my community. So I consider the entire Colorado Plateau as my home base. And throughout my entire lifetime, I have lived a lifetime of experiencing climate change. And this is a picture I have right here of just recently of the smoke that's coming in my area in New Mexico. When you look, even daily on the daily now for me, when I'm checking the weather, it's a fire weather danger. And it's just so crazy to think that like fire weather, is a form of weather now. You can also see that there's a lot of particulate matter in the sky when we're looking at like our areas for farming. So just having all of the smoke in the air, we have some really aggressive winds, high winds, and some really intense sunlight. And this makes it very difficult farming conditions, just in the Southwest. And when we're thinking beyond farming conditions, we're thinking about the landscape. And so a study done by a colleague of mine, Jaime Yazzie, and those from Northern Arizona University School of Forestry, looked at different management strategies of Navajo forests and predicted how climate change would impact those forests by the end of the century. And even with the most involved management strategies of thinning and burning, it is predicted that our Navajo forests are to be reduced almost to 90%. And this is incredibly concerning because I can imagine that this is also reflective of not just Navajo forests, but forests throughout the world. And when we're having issues of climate change and forest fires, we're also facing issues of disease and infestation, and we're having woody plant encroachment, where invasive species are coming through, we're having outbreaks of pests, and our springs are drying up, and we have groundwater and aquifer depletion. In addition to my community, we have food insecurity. I'm living in a food desert, and a food desert means that I have limited access to affordable and nutritious foods. As you can see, there's a picture here from produce from the local tribal grocery store. You know, it's easy to spend $7, $8 on some produce, like romaine lettuce or, you know, some berries. Whereas for the same price, you know, you can buy like processed foods, you know, entire meals or soda, like for it's just crazy how, like, you know, the prices of like sugar or processed foods are cheaper than our actual like healthy and nutritious foods we have to pay more money for. And so for me and those in my community, we actually prefer to drive off the reservation 40, 50 miles to actually just receive fresh produce. And I don't really consider that local when we're having to drive so far. In addition, I just wanted to go into more detail of climate change on Navajo Nation. My family comes from the Loop area, which is just on the outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. And in the background, you can see that's the San Francisco Peaks right there. Absolutely beautiful. And then my family's land is located along the Little Colorado River. And so as you can see in the background of this picture, this is where the river is. The Little Colorado River is actually quite dominated by tamarisks. It used to be dominated by, you know, cottonwoods and willows and a very healthy riparian habitat. But now over 90% of the vegetation on the Little Colorado River is tamarisk. And the issue with tamarisk is they're able to access the water table deeper than native species. And they also, you know, they make the area more xeric, and they dry up water resources for local species. And the great thing with invasive species in tamarisk is they don't really have that many predators. And so they're able to take over the riparian area so easily, you know, take over the cottonwoods and the willows. In addition to my area where I am from, is we have an extensive open grazing history, which has led to reduced vegetation cover, and also with the presence of cattle in the watershed that causes incising of the water banks and the arroyos. And their presence has also caused disturbance to the soil and helped invasive pioneering species to come in. On Navajo Nation, we have increasing trends of lower precipitation and increasing arid conditions. This picture on the left is a picture of my homeland. You can see how sparse the vegetation is, the ground cover. And in a nearby study, someone had also been doing a study of the vegetation cover, and I just wanted to note how similar, the rate of vegetation cover it is from my homeland on the left and from the study on the right, and just showing just how decreased our vegetation is on the whole landscape. In addition to having all of these factors, we have these sand dunes that are encroaching people's livelihoods and their homes. And so with the loss of vegetation and the increase of temperature and decrease in precipitation, we're having really intense effects of wind and soil erosion. You can see the sand dune on the left is coming close to taking over homes. There are homes that have been taken over by sand dunes. And then the picture on the right shows the encroachment of the sand dunes from an aerial view. These sand dunes can move and migrate 115 feet per year. So I'm here to talk to you about some of the methods of Indigenous use that we have used for thousands of years to effectively feed our communities in an arid landscape. For Indigenous land use, that means that we're blending our communities and culture and land management for sustainable use and the benefit for the ecosystem and the people. It's an integrated and interdependent relationship. Back, my ancestors, on this land in the Southwest, the entire landscape was our grocery store. We didn't have the ability to go and just have a little market to go get our groceries. We used the entire landscape, and we were in it, made it a really bountiful landscape. This entire landscape was used, to provide our supplies and medicine as well. I think of foods, ancestral foods that include, quail and turkey, deer and rabbit, but we have our wild foods such as there's wild greens, wild berries, wild grains, and wild roots that had sustained my people and cultures for many years. And these were all using dry farming practices. And so this is a map of kind of the region of dry farming practices and the tribes that I wanted to acknowledge who are practicing these methods. Dry farming, if people aren't familiar, is the ability to farm without any extra uses of water. So we're completely dependent on precipitation. And I think that is an incredible feat because in the Southwest, we're receiving, less than 20 inches of precipitation a year. We have over 300 sunny days of sun exposure a year, and we have lots of wind. And so it's the time to, look at our Indigenous science and knowledge and technology and see how we can apply this now for climate change and food security. This picture on the right, the ancestral terrace gardens in the Sonoran Desert, those are 500-year-old terrace gardens that are still evident. And so this is technology that really persists. So just to touch on traditional ecological knowledge, it's place-based knowledge that observes and strategically utilizes ecological relationships. It's used to sustainably secure fishing, hunting, agriculture, and other important agricultural aspects. It's about understanding, and enhancing relationships within the environment. It's also being resourceful and using nearby materials. an amazing product of traditional ecological knowledge is having heirloom seeds. And so, for example, we have, I guess to talk about the heirloom seeds and reciprocal relationship, we have the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. And these plant foods are actually able to grow without additional water when they are heirloom seeds. And so, for example, I have Hopi blue corn and other types of heirloom corn from the region. And this corn is able to grow without additional water when it's planted properly. And the roots are actually able to really reach deeper than, modern day corn to reach, the water table. And so when we're looking at like heirloom seeds, there are seeds in the area, that are adapted to the dry and, drought conditions. So in addition to having a reciprocal relationship, the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. So the corn provides a trellis for the beans to climb up. The beans are actually able to deposit nitrogen into the soil for the benefit of all of the plants in the area. And the squash have these lovely wide leaves that provide a nice shady ground cover and protect the soil and the water in the soil from rapidly evaporating. And so this is a small demonstration of traditional ecological knowledge. So the first start out with methods of ecological knowledge for the Southwest is to look at how water is placed on the landscape. And so we're looking at watersheds of different sizes. You can look at the large watershed, maybe looking at the entire Colorado River watershed, or even looking at your own personal watershed, just where your land site is and seeing where the water is falling. And so when we're looking at Indigenous knowledge, the idea is to plant the water first. And we're looking at areas where water is concentrating and flowing and naturally collecting. Slopes, angles, and washes, arroyos, along canyon walls are areas that water is going to start collecting. And there are also studies done in the 1940s by a Harvard expedition coming out to the Southwest and studying these dry farming fields. And they noticed that the fields that were planted in the washes and the arroyos were definitely closer to the water table. And so those fields had direct access to that. In addition to looking at location, we're looking at the soil type. The most ideal conditions for dry farming practices is planting in loamy sands and sand deposits. The sand acts as a sponge and retains moisture, and the loose sand on top acts as a mulch, which helps cover and limit that evaporation, and it keeps the plants cooler, the roots cooler as well. And so you can see this is actually a picture of some Hopi cornfields growing, just off of the annual precipitation. And so let's take a look at this picture. This is an example of, I just want you to direct you to this little corner right here. These are peach trees planted in sand deposits below this mesa. In addition, there are examples of traditional ecological knowledge, and I've heard this mentioned earlier today, and I know it's a big topic, is compost. Especially as agroforestry, I think we just love compost. I don't know, I love compost. I have a lot of compost at my house, and I'm growing worms and stuff, but it's amazing to think that there's actually a natural compost that is traveling on the landscape, and it's traveling with the water and the wind. You have this fine sediment that's traveling. And so for example, when we're looking at these fields, let me just point them right there. So these fields are strategically placed in the wash to receive that direct flow of water. And they're also picking up a lot of fine sediment, organic matter, and nutrients that's being picked up with the water flow and depositing it straight onto your fields. It's also a really natural way of topsoil renewal. There's my little demonstration. So we're just looking at a brush dam. And so brush dams are structures that are used in our dry farming practices. And so with the brush dams, it helps slow down that flow of water that's coming down into the arroyo or the wash. So that way your plants aren't getting, you know, that direct hit of monsoon water or precipitation. Actually, you know, starts filtering that out and slowing it down. But also with the brush dams, we have water that's being able to wash out over the sides of the banks and behind. And so we have not only all of that compost and water that's being deposited upstream as well. And these brush dams, they're not super, you know, I guess, you know, crazy with resources or material. It's people just use, you know, juniper, a pinyon, or even just whatever they were collecting from their, you know, just brushy, you know, like debris, and they're just putting it in the wash, or you can stabilize it with some of the sticks too. So these can range from really large brush dams to very small, whatever size you want to experiment with. We also have rock dams that have been used, and these can be placed, you know, a year ahead of time, which is what farmers have been doing in the past. Kind of like you're preparing your vegetable garden, you know, the season before. So these dams are placed in the washes or the arroyos, and they're collecting that soil and those nutrients so you can plant ahead of time. And some of these rock dams, you know, they can be stacked, or they can just be a single, you know, line of rocks too. And here's an example of some of the rock. There's a study in southern Arizona where folks were using the rock dam structure. And so up here, you can see the first year, and then we're over a 3-year period. You can see in the second picture, we have sediment being deposited and vegetation growing. And then in the third year, it's a completely different landscape. So I just want to revisit this picture. And so instead of looking at the peach trees in this location, we're actually going to look at these wonderful terrace gardens in the back. And terrace gardens are used to help stabilize slope, and they also help retain that seasonal precipitation. I like to think of terrace gardens and also refer to as mini micro watersheds. And so these are, you know, very involved ways of farming, but you're creating, you know, just a direct little basin to help capture that water so it's not running off the slope. And it's also creating little windbreaks and little, you know, maybe some small shade for plants nearby as well. Even smaller than the terrace gardens we have waffle gardens. You're not growing waffles. But instead, this is in a small or individual basin that is directly catering to a microclimate of a plant. So some of these walls can be actually quite high. I've seen some where they're 4 or 6 inches high for these waffle gardens, and that helps provide, you know, a wind barrier for these intense windstorms we're getting. We're also, you know, having a nice large basin to capture that water, and it provides partial shade for these, you know, for your when you're creating these nurse habitats. Other methods include rock mulch. I know mulch is very popular, like a cover ground or cover crop, and so a natural resource is just like these rock sites or using rock, because these rocks can actually provide a nurse habitat for plants to grow in. And so for Indigenous farmers, they had observed that there's water runoff that's collecting under these river rocks and pebbles. And so that's replicated in the fields. And here's a single, you know, kind of rock grid. I was kind of mentioning with the rock dams. This is a landscape-wide example of, you know, just a layer of rocks that help stabilize the soil. We're minimizing evaporation and reducing the wind velocity. And we're also trapping some of the soil nutrients that are traveling around. So that's, we also, I've heard the mention of like windbreaks, and of course that's very popular in agroforestry. And so this is ancestral methods of windbreaks of just planting even small brush in the area. It also can help with the silt trap and collecting leaf litter, but it's also a great way for natural pest management because the windbreaks help provide habitat for birds and other local species. And the last thing I'll mention for some of our methods of dry farming is the use of digging sticks. This is very, very low impact on the soil. And so it allows for the integrity of the soil and the moisture content to remain intact. And also there are some plants that we use while for digging, maybe for wild onions, that actually really like that little disturbance from the digging stick. And so after harvesting a little bit of the onions, you go back and there's just kind of an explosion of onions because they really like that disturbance from the digging stick. I just like to promote some of these methods because, you know, traditional ecological knowledge enhances our ecosystem functions. We have nutrient cycling, we're building our watershed and the soil, we're working on pest management, and we're creating resilience and biodiversity. I really think that using these forms of dry farming are the most appropriate methods for us to look at when we're looking at climate change and food security for the Southwest. I think that these methods, they're, you know, they don't require many resources. You know, we have the resources here on the land to work with the building, you know, the terrace gardens and the waffle gardens or the rock grid or the brush dams. But they also can help us with climate change adaptation and creating these intense areas of wildlife and biodiversity and strengthening that for years to come. And then I think that using these methods of dry farming can definitely help with local food security, not only for my community, but I think that for the greater Southwest community, when we're looking at use of water and farming. So I wanted to show you guys one of my favorite places. This is the Flowering Tree Permaculture Center, located in northern New Mexico. This is Roxanne Swensel's property. She's Santa Clara Pueblo, and she has a 30-plus-year-old food forest just right smack in the middle of the desert, and I love it. And so I just want to note, look how lush and green this is compared to the rest of the environment. So let me take you inside the food forest. just within the first 8 years of her creating this food forest, there are over 500 species recorded. She has a really intense topsoil. I think it's over 8 inches taller in depth than her neighboring lands, and how much soil she's built from just this food forest. And it just completely taps into, that whole ecosystem and nutrient cycling. She's got shade cover from these beautiful trees. And they're also creating microclimates and creating, really nice habitat and protecting her plants from frost. To the point that she's growing a bamboo forest in her little forest in there, which is insane because bamboo is not, adapted to the New Mexico climate. But with her use of dry farming practices and looking at, permaculture and agroforestry ancestral knowledge, she was able to capture that water and create these nurse habitats. So just inside of her forest, I wanted to share that not only does she have a bamboo forest in there, but we saw she had little ponds. There were rabbits in there. We ate grapes off her house, like little giraffe, sticking out her necks and eating grapes. And she even had an apple orchard in the backside of her house. And it was just really amazing to see someone doing this work. And she's also producing lumber on her property too, and able to sell that lumber out. And so I wanted to share a little bit of some of the work that I'm doing. I'm also working on creating food forests, here in the Southwest, and I've been creating looking into, native plant species that are edible that we can look at. And so some of the ones I am using in my garden and looking to use or would like to use are juniper. Just to mention that, like the juniper berries are used in food, and the ash is actually used in cornmeal mush. So we actually cook with juniper ash, and it has a lot of, vitamins and nutrients in the juniper. There's mesquite, which is very drought tolerant tree. We have prickly pear. Here's a bowl of prickly pear fruit that I've harvested, and just by itself is an amazingly refreshing drink. There are other native species to look at, and to incorporate is rice grass. I have a picture right here of rice grass, and those grains are used in cooking. There's also yucca and the yucca fruits. We have canyon grape. I'm growing cliff rose. There's blackberry. Sunflowers are incredibly popular food to eat. Honey locusts, I love to have. I'm just now starting to grow that, but they are helping deposit nitrogen into the soil. Golden currants is a delicious berry to eat, and Mormon tea. So there's like a very small list of edible species, but there's lots of medicinal plants and other plants that are used, for their wood or for other kind of cultural uses. And in addition to looking at native species, I think about how I can incorporate these other native species and food species together. Because it's not just Flowering Tree Permaculture Institute. I've visited with several other places such as Hopi Tuskwa Permaculture Institute, where we're integrating the native species and the trees and the fruit trees, and we're integrating that with our modern kind of plants and vegetables that we're used to eating. And so I like to think of like, we're using ground covers such as like the forbs or grasses. I like to use white clover or field peas to help break up the soil and add nitrogen. There's daikon radish or Jerusalem artichoke as well. Amaranth is a super grain that people love to, I love to eat. I don't know if anyone's eaten amaranth, but I like to cook it in a rice cooker with blueberries, and it's an amazing breakfast. We also have like our heirloom corn beans and squash. There's melon. This is a little guild I have of lettuces, and here's a tomato growing. This is from my, a few years ago, my garden in Flagstaff. And so there's a lot of different ways to think about how we can incorporate these plants, looking at a Southwest climate, and how we can minimize, using a lot of water to grow these plants. So lastly, I just wanted to end with my personal recommendations to find some heirloom seeds. There's a Seed Savers Exchange. There's Native Seeds and Seed Search. Plants of the Southwest are areas that I get my seeds from. I'm sure there's more. Here's some books I recommend that are presented from an Indigenous view about eating Indigenous in the Southwest. And so there's Eating the Landscape, The People's Ecology, Food Sovereignty the Navajo Way, and then Fire on the Plateau. And I also wanted to mention there's a video that my husband, Jeff Kai, has made of documenting our work of looking at revisiting our ancestral foods. So that's his video right there. He actually was featured at the LA Skins Fest and the Santa Fe Film Festival. And we're also going to keep working and documenting our work on the food forests that we're doing in the area. And I just want to, there's a few of my mentors, but if you're looking for people to sponsor or coordinate with, or just look into the work that they're doing, there's the Hopi Tutsqua Permaculture Institute, Native American Food Alliance, Aubergine Alliance. I've taken classes from the Institute for American Indian Arts that talk about medicinal plants of the area, as well as working and growing those medicinal plants. And then, of course, Flowering Tree Permaculture Institute. So if you're looking to keep in touch, feel free to contact me at that email, feastfeastfoodlab@gmail.com. So open the questions.
Kat, thank you so much. If you could go open the Q&A, just mouse over that at the bottom of your screen, and you'll see several questions from our online attendees before we get to our in-person ones.
Great. So I see one question. Do tribes have native heirloom seed bank? And can we grow seedlings of perennial berries for your reservations to help in our greenhouses? That's a great question. I do know of, there are seed banks that are being created. There's the Tezuki seed bank, which is really close to Santa Clara and northern New Mexico. I'm not quite sure how accessible it is to work and coordinate with growing those seeds. But I do know that, let me go back, that the Native Seeds Exchange, they also work with heirloom seeds. One of their former directors, she actually is an Indigenous woman who works with the Seed Savers Exchange program. So they actually work with farmers and doing perennial berries, stuff like that. So I definitely recommend looking into the work that the Seed Saver Exchange is doing. I'll get on to the next question. Could we get that source link put in the chat, the one on the dry farmland techniques? I'm not quite sure if like what link they're referring to. Oh, And then there's the next one. Thank you. Could we possibly get a copy of all the sources you use in this presentation? You know, I think the best way to direct this is I wrote a paper, my thesis paper, or my master's paper on this work, and it has all my resources cited on it. So if you go through the NAU School of Forestry and look for my name, I believe you'll be able to find that paper. But I think I can also follow up with the SWAAN Conference and send that information to you all as well.
Thanks so much, Kat. That's it for the online Q&A. So Steve, I'll turn it over for you for live Q&A.
Use this microphone.
If you want to step around the front of the computer here,
Okay.
it should pick up
Yeah.
right here. There we go.
Kat, that was an excellent presentation. I really appreciated how you went from big picture to the small picture, and what we can do at the local level, which you've done great work. Your title is a regenerative farmer. So I really like for you to describe what that means to you, and that idea of regenerative farmer, even down to regenerative gardening. So thank you for your presentation. That's my question.
Yeah, you know, that's a great question. I guess for me, for regenerative farming, I think it's along the lines of agroforestry and kind of permaculture, where we're looking at adding to the landscape, you know, and creating. I don't know. I don't have like the written definition of regenerative. To me, like regenerative is like really messy gardening, you know, and farming, where I'm not just growing, you know, like the corn, beans, and squash, but I'm like putting, you know, plants in there, like all the native species I can. I'm just trying to maximize, you know, diversity within my garden. And so I don't know, my main goal for, you know, as regenerative gardening or farming isn't necessarily for the food crop, but it's for you know, creating that resiliency in the landscape and a safe space, you know, for wildlife and pollinators and stuff like that. But I don't know, I guess for me, I just figured regenerative was along the lines of agroforestry and the work that we're doing in that area.
I can relay it, or you can come up and it's nice for Kat to be able to see you guys too.
Hi, Kat.
Hello.
So I know Lillian Hill at the Hopi Tatsuquah Permaculture Initiative is doing lunar basins on the downslope side of a tree. So that's catching surface runoff and infiltrating it at the root system. But the waffle gardens seem to, those walls seem like they would close off surface flow. Have you found that there's different contexts where a waffle garden might make more sense than the lunar basin type approach that of infiltrating in sunken basins for maximum water retention? I'm just curious your thoughts on that, because I haven't seen the waffle garden actually in practice. It was great to see those photos.
Yeah, those are great questions. I think to me, the waffle gardens work a lot more on the flat landscape, whereas those other forms of dry farming seem to be on like a very steep or sloped angles. And so when we're looking at a flat landscape, I feel like the waffle gardens, you know, you're creating that edge and those slopes and the contours to capture that water.
Thanks.
Can you relay this?
You bet.
Kat, have you ever made anything out of Indian rice grass? Every time I look at Indian rice grass, I think it would be a net decrease. You know, I would expend more energy, more calories, expend more energy than what gain from harvesting it and grinding it. And so just, you know, I'd like to make some bread or something out of Indian rice grass, but it just looks like a lot of work to me.
So I actually know somebody doing some research on this, but Kat, did you catch that from the room?
No, I didn't.
So one was kind of, when you look at Indian rice grass, it seems like it's a net calorie deficit. If you're between the harvesting and cooking and everything that you have to do. So have you used it? What are you using it for? Thoughts on that end?
Yeah, you know, rice grass, I think right now it's a really difficult grain to work with because you need a lot of it, you know, to kind of, I think, make a meal out of it. So that one's pretty labor intensive, you know, but I would like to explore it, you know, as a grain to use in the native area. I prefer, you know, if you're looking for more substance, it's like amaranth. But yeah, I definitely agree that the Indian rice grass and some of these like very fine grasses, you're going to put in a lot of energy, you know, for a small product.
Excellent, thank you. Well, let's give a round of applause for Kat.
Thank you.
Roarious applause for you, Kat. You can't tell, but it's deafening. Thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it.
All right, I look forward to seeing the rest.
Okay, so next up, we have Kelly Bull. So Kelly is a regenerative landscape designer and educator, and the owner of Kelly Bull Permaculture Design. She designs large-scale land restoration projects with United Designers International, and also specializes in designing residential landscapes for the do-it-yourself-minded homeowner. She consults and provides workshops to empower and teach inexperienced gardeners how to grow and care for regenerative backyard landscapes. As a graduate of Dr. Elaine Ingham's Soil Food Web School, she is passionate about soil health and is on a mission to connect everyone with the amazing microscopic world beneath our feet. Kelly's presentation is titled Mind Your Microbes, Permaculture Design for Optimal Soil Health. We'll get this going.
And
Bev, are you seeing the presenter screen or the slides?
I'm seeing the multiple slides. It isn't in presenter mode on the shared screen.
My other computer died, so I can't double check myself.
Yeah, it's not in presenter mode. So if you can click presenter.
There we go. Is that right?
Yeah, it needs to be, that's that same thing that you had earlier with, yeah.
what?
So, yep, the presentation is up, but it's not in like audience view.
Right.
You just have to start slideshow, get the slideshow up there.
It's still not. The problem is it thinks that that is a different screen.
Oh, so
We have to figure it out.
Okay, let's see. We're gonna stop share for a second. And then we're gonna share screen. Because that's a different screen, right?
It thinks the projector is a dual screen.
Oh, okay. So if we do this, and then where do we press play?
It's him.
Of course it is. Okay, let's move this thing. This one? This one?
Yeah.
What do you see now?
we see We see the presenter mode where it gives you the next up slide.
Like the apple P, and then is it Sugo apple P, and then so it's doing extend, but we want duplicate, right?
Right.
There,
But now we all see that mode.
but we should be able to do the other screen.
Without
Share the
presenter.
Other screen, I think now.
Yeah, if you don't do, yeah. Instead of that.
Yes.
mode.
Oh, I see.
All
So now
right.
you can, yay.
Okay.
Great.
Let's move our toolbar back out of the way.
All right, are we ready? All right, well, thank you guys for having me. I always like to jump on every opportunity I can if I can be surrounded by other plant people. So very happy to be here. And as a plant person, I think that my journey all begins with my gateway plant, which is not coming up. There we go. Can I move this down? It's not going anywhere. That's as far as it goes. So you have to know that it says rhododendron there. So my gateway plant, which is a rhododendron, I grew up in Georgia, and we had these really beautiful, amazing rhododendron bushes in our front yard, and my mom would help me pick bouquets of them to bring to my teachers when I was little. And I have this very vivid memory of asking my mom to write rhododendron down on a piece of paper, because that's a hard word for a first grader. And I was standing at the bus stop memorizing rhododendron, and then memorizing how to spell it too, because I really wanted to correctly identify it to my teachers when I delivered the bouquet. And then this skill of memorizing plants really came in handy when I then went to study horticulture. Buttons are not working. At the University of Georgia, and memorized millions of plants there. And I loved studying horticulture so much. I could not get enough of learning how plants grow and function, and I hung on every single word that my professor said, except for one thing that I could not wrap my head around or get on board with, and that was the use of chemicals. And so in my greenhouse management class, we were growing a crop of poinsettias, and I told my professor that I would not be using chemicals on my poinsettias. So he took that moment to make an example out of me, and he told the whole class that if we wanted to make it in the horticulture industry, we had to use chemicals, and otherwise it was not economically viable. So I said, okay, well, then in my soil science class, I remember memorizing all of the amendments that I needed to add to soil, so the NPK, what to do if the soil was too alkaline, what to do if it was too acidic. And I mean, call me frugal, but I think I'm more resourceful, but I hated the idea of having to depend on buying bags of amendments and fertilizers, and I didn't want to do it. And call me a neglectful plant mom if you want, but I really just thought my plants should be able to take care of themselves. Didn't know if that was too much to ask. So then I went and worked on an organic farm and learned that, just as I suspected, you do not need chemicals, synthetic chemicals, to grow these very happy, healthy plants that we were growing. So that was a win, that I knew that there was another way. But although we were using natural fertilizers like bone meal and blood meal, we were still buying things in those bags, and they were really expensive. So then I wondered, well, was my professor actually right? Is this actually economically feasible? I don't really know. So lots of questions going on in my mind. But 4 years ago, I studied permaculture, and I got my permaculture design certificate at Kirkby in Basalt. So we've seen a lot of pictures from there, and a lot of you guys have heard of Jerome, and we learned about him. And thank you to Kat for mentioning also that traditional ecological knowledge is where permaculture comes from. And as I was learning this, it felt like I was relearning common sense that I should have just known. And we probably all did know, and something happened and then we forgot. But things like holistic site assessments and really getting to know the land before you act upon it and what the current conditions are, learning to work with nature rather than working against nature, and learning about plant guilds and polycultures, and by planting plants together, they can take care of each other. Like that is what I was looking for, plants that would take care of themselves. And so that was a really big step in the right direction that really got me excited. But recently, a final piece of the puzzle of the big picture that I was really looking for came when I took Dr. Elaine Ingham's Soil Food Web School. And everything that I learned in that course and I'm about to teach you proved that you do not need synthetic chemicals to grow happy, healthy plants. And in fact, they are detrimental. And that there are billions, trillions of free workers in our soil that want to do the hard labor for us. We just need to get out of the way and let them do it. So, and then I just want to tell my professor also, if trillions of free workers in the soil is not an economically viable option, then I don't really know what actually is. So I became a permaculture landscape designer because I'm very passionate about regenerating land, depleted land, about connecting people with nature, especially in their own backyards. I think that gardening, farming, landscaping should feel easy, and I think it should be fun. And so I want to teach people that. And I think so often people get so overwhelmed with a piece of property or land that they just end up doing nothing to it, and they don't get all of the benefits that can come from it. I also realized that my design style and my gardening philosophy stems a lot from watching my grandmothers and my mom garden as a kid. So this is my grandmother Lola. She is in her garden in Nova Scotia, and she would be out in her garden for hours, wandering aimlessly, seemingly, and she would just come over here and pick a weed. Over here, she would go harvest a seed pod. Nothing was ever very pressing. She was just futzing. And I think that futzing is what we should all be striving for in our landscapes and our gardens and our farms, that nothing should be so demanding of our attention, that nature should be doing most of the work, that we should have these really resilient, stable ecosystems where nature's doing the heavy lifting, and that really all that's left for us to do is just futz. So let me tell you how to get to that point, how to just futz. It all has to do with soil, in my opinion. And so very quick soil primer here. The three things that we generally keep in mind when we're talking about soil health is the soil texture or the structure, the chemistry, and the biology. And we're going to focus mostly on the biology today because it is the biology that really heavily influences the structure and the chemistry. So here's our soil food web. We are going to focus on the microbes today. So the microscopic ones you can't see with your eye, you need a microscope for. So nematodes, fungus, bacteria, and protozoa. Those are heavy hitters, big players in this game. I think that it is amazing that if you hold out your hand and you think about just a palm full of healthy soil in your hand, you would be holding more living organisms than there are humans on the entire planet. So super important life in our soil. And if that does not blow your mind, I got another fact for you too. But also thinking about the microbes in soil, 99% of them are good beneficial microbes, good bacteria, good fungus. The 1% that cause our plant pathogens are what hogs all of the spotlight. And so we concentrate on those, and you hear fungus and bacteria or amoeba and you think that it's bad, but 99% are good ones. So mind-blowing facts. If that didn't get you, I think that this one will. What if I told you that all soils around the globe have all the nutrients plants could ever need already in them right now? I'm seeing some disbelief in some places. I know some of you have grown your tomatoes and they had yellowing leaves, and you had a crop that failed and it didn't have all the nutrients it needed. But there was a study done where they took over 100,000 samples, hundreds of thousands of samples all over the world. All the nutrients were there. So what is going on? Why do you think that you and your backyard are the exception to all of these hundreds of thousands of samples? Let me show you what's going on. So you have a crystalline layer in the chemistry of your soil. So it's mostly silica, and the chemical bonds are so strong that the ions of the nutrients, the plant nutrients, are stuck to that silica crystalline layer, so tightly bonded that they're locked up. They're there, they're just locked up. So this is like having an enormous safe full of all the bags of NPK, all of the fertilizer, all the macro micronutrients that you would ever need in that safe, easily accessible to you, except for it's locked. And all you have to do is get the combination. So spoiler alert, the person who has the combination are the microbes in your soil. They have the power to unlock that safe. So for me, it makes so much more sense to spend your time unlocking the safe and finding the combination to the safe for the endless supply of nutrients, rather than continuing to go out and buy nutrients and add them to your soil. They're already there. So you ever notice how no one is ever like, oh, hey, you have a little bit of soil on your face, or like, man, I got some soil in my eye? No, it's always dirt, and dirt is displaced soil. It doesn't have a connection to anything. It doesn't serve a purpose. It's floating around. It's lifeless. It's dirt. So we don't want dirt. We're treating our soil like dirt. So it's funny, we mentioned the Dust Bowl earlier today. We're kind of in a current Dust Bowl in Colorado Springs. The mountains disappeared a couple weeks ago, and yesterday it was pretty awful as well. So this picture is pretty relevant. So really, to understand how important microbes are in our soil, I want to take you on a little journey from dirt to soil. And so here's kind of how we got to the situation in the Dust Bowl. You know, it didn't help that we were going through a huge drought, but we also had a lot of mouths to feed. So we're trying to create a lot of food. And so we invent this lovely invention, the plow, which seems such a great miracle solution to our problem of not having enough food. So it's able to plow through the soil, fluff up the soil. Now we can have roots that can easily go through the soil. We're churning up weeds so we can grow a bunch of crops without having to hire a ton of labor to weed. It seems like a really great option. But now I want you to imagine that you are a soil microorganism. So you're in a bacteria or a fungus, protozoa, a nematode, and you're living your happy little microbe life, and you have microbe friends and microbe families, and you're making babies every 20 minutes, and you have this very fulfilling job, and you're adding back to the world, and everything is going great. And then a tractor tornado comes through and demolishes your town. Now, you are displaced. You don't know where your friends and family are. Most of them are actually dead. Every time you get your feet back under you and you think you can start rebuilding your city, the tractor tornado comes through again and kills your town. So this is dirt. There's nothing stable. There's no systems. There's no connection. We don't want this. So now imagine that the tractor tornado breaks down and nature gets a chance to rebuild. So here's what might happen. First on the scene, it's probably bacteria. Number one, because it's the most abundant. There's tons of it. Number two, because it's the smallest. So if you look at all the little green dots, those are bacteria. And So it's least likely to have been chopped up by the tractor tornado, being as small as it is. So it looks like this underneath the microscope, but I want you to imagine it like this, like Pac-Man or like Mrs. Pac-Man. So Pac-Man is going about its day, and it's important to keep in mind that there are two elements that really fuel the microbe world. There's carbon and there's nitrogen. So carbon is like the little dots, very easily accessible. You can get it just going on your route. But nitrogen are your bigger blinking dots. And there's not as many of those. Other people are wanting the nitrogen. It's in high demand. And so bacteria is very efficient at getting this nitrogen. And when it eats the nitrogen, then it locks it up in its body. And it's pretty much till death do they part. So that bacteria or that nitrogen is really locked up into the bacteria. Okay. So Pac-Man or bacteria has had a full meal of carbon and nitrogen. And then what happens? Nature calls. So there will be a lot of poop talk coming after this, because I know as farmers, gardeners, we know the value of manure, but I'm not sure if you know just how important microbe manure is. It is very key in our turning dirt into soil. So here's why. Bacteria has like a poo glue. It is sticky. And why is that important? Well, down here, we have dirt particles. There's nothing holding them together. It's just a bunch of dirt particles. So it's really easy for one particle to blow away in the wind or wash away in the water, or to be compressed if you step on it. But if there's bacteria present and they have poo glue, what they do is they glue the individual particles together. So now that's what we call a microaggregate. So if you think about when the wind blows this time, now it has to blow 7 particles that are a microaggregate together. So it's harder to blow it away. It's harder to wash it away. And now it's also important is it's creating little pockets of pores. So oxygen can stay in those pores, water can stay in those pores, and now we're starting to build a little bit of structure. We're able to hold that oxygen in the water in our dirt, which is coming into soil. Love this part. The next, really cool characteristic also about the bacteria poo glue is it is alkaline. So it can actually change the pH of your soil. So yay, no more bags of lime. I got so excited when I could finally prove that I don't need to bring in lime to a soil and that I can make bacteria do it for me. So then next on the scene is fungus. There goes the poster. And mushrooms tend to hog all the spotlight with fungus, the fruiting body of fungus, but really the hyphae is, I think, where all the action is happening and underneath the soil. And fungus is so important for a million different reasons. One of them is carbon sequestration. When you think of hyphae maturing and growing and getting longer, the older it gets and the more mature it is, the more carbon it's able to sequester and hold in its body, keeping that in the soil. So that's a really important reason. But also, this is what it looks like under the microscope, the fungal hyphae strand. But I want you to think of it like this, like the cowboy or the cowgirl of the microbe world. And what is happening is the fungus also has poo glue, and it uses its poo glue like a giant lasso. And where the bacteria had micro aggregates, now the fungus is lassoing the micro aggregates together into macro aggregates, bigger chunks of soil. So now think about how hard it is for wind and water to wash away or blow away a macro aggregate. And now look at how many pores are in between the micro aggregates and then the macro aggregates. So now we're really able to hold oxygen and water in our soils because of the bacteria and the fungus. Another great characteristic of fungus is its poo glue is acidic. So with more fungus in your soil, you can acidify your soil. So now no more bags of sulfur. Next on the list is protozoa. So these are our amoebas, our flagellates, our ciliates. And in order to really understand their function, I want you to think of them as the ghosts of Pac-Man. So the ghosts of Pac-Man are running around trying to eat Pac-Man or bacteria. So protozoa are really important for keeping bacterial populations in check. So we do want bacteria, but we don't want all bacteria. So when you introduce the protozoa, it really helps with population control. It also helps with nitrogen cycling. And in order to understand that, you have to do a little microbe math. So here's your word problem. Protozoa, or the ghosts, need 30 dots of carbon and 1 dot of nitrogen for a satisfying meal. If bacteria bodies, or Pac-Man, have 5 dots of carbon in them, or 5 dots of carbon, this thing won't move, let me move this. 5 dots of carbon and 1 dot of nitrogen in them. How many bacteria does a protozoa need to be full? I'm gonna need an answer from you guys.
150.
No.
6.
There we go. Thank you. 6 Pac-Man or 6 bacteria. Okay. Follow-up question.
Okay, so you divide the whole.
Protozoa can only handle 1 dot of nitrogen for every 30 dots of carbon. How many extra nitrogen does the protozoa have inside of them?
5.
Thanks, Bill. Okay, 5 dots of nitrogen. So this is really important because this puts those nitrogen dots, the blinking lights of Pac-Man, back into the game. And now other things have a chance to have this nitrogen. So it could be another bacteria that scoops it up quickly, but it could also be a plant. So when, what's that?
And this is the opportunity to make this protozoa poop.
Yes, thank you. So as the protozoa, and thank you, that's where we're going.
Poop enthusiast in the crowd.
Yeah, it's great. So as the protozoa poops, it poops out ammonium. And that is the preferable nitrogen form that most plants want to take up. And I will mention to you also that if this bar was out of the way, it would say that these green dots are labeled nitrate. So nitrate is the other form of nitrogen that plants can take up, but only certain plants can take up nitrogen. Only certain plants can take up ammonium. Some of them can take a mixture of both. But do you know which plants like nitrate? Anybody? Weeds. Weeds prefer nitrate. So weeds have a beneficial relationship with bacterial dominated soils. If it's all bacteria, that's where your weeds are. So you can look into a field and see if it's all weeds, you probably have a bacterial dominated soil. So by looking at the plants that grow in an area, it tells you a lot about the soil. And then looking at the soil will tell you a lot about the plants that can grow there.
Clicking the green bar, we get go away. Or just where it says you are screen share.
I think if you go to the more, it will let you diminish it. I video, yeah, I video panel.
Hide video panel.
Yeah.
On the height floating.
Yeah, I
Floating media. Nice, thank you. Great. Okay, now we can see nitrate.
Can I ask a question about what you just said?
Yeah.
So, weeds, are like spinach or mallows, for example,
Mhm.
lots of nutritional benefits.
Yep.
So how is that different than what we're actually planting,
Great.
especially annual?
If you don't mind, so for you guys at home, yeah, for you guys at home, she's asking weeds, there's lots of medicinal benefits, good nutritional, great parts of weeds. Are you asking kind of how do you determine the difference between
Yeah, because
weeds and regular plants, or?
Yeah, so
Okay.
how are regular plants different in what they uptake than weeds?
Okay.
I guess, especially with annuals.
Yeah, if you'll actually hold that question for just a minute, I think I might be able to answer it in a coming slide. And then if I don't, I will ask you and then see if we can.
Part of that is defining what a weed is.
Yeah, totally. Yep. This is all very, there's a lot of very gray area in there. And some plants that we know of actually do really want nitrate, and I'll talk about that in a second. So the last microorganism that we'll talk about are nematodes, and nematodes are microscopic worms that can eat bacteria, they can eat protozoa, they can eat fungus, they can eat other nematodes, and they're also very important in the poop loop. And they cycle nitrogen, and when they poop out ammonium as well. So that's putting more nitrogen back into the system that can feed our plants or other organisms. One really cool thing about this picture is that although nematodes can eat fungus, fungus can actually eat nematodes as well. And this is a fungal hyphae strand, and it has a special little loop of 3 hyphae cells. And if a nematode crawls through the little trap, it triggers those 3 cells and they fill with water and pressurize and then suffocate the nematode, and then the fungus eats all its nutrients, which I think is pretty cool. Yeah, nature's neat. Okay, so this is where I think I might be able to answer that question. So this is natural succession of plants and the fungal bacterial ratio and how it changes throughout succession. So if we start here in the bare rock side, that's going to be, if you look at fungus to bacteria, pretty much 100% bacteria. And the reason for that is that bacteria has very, very strong enzymes that can break apart the rock and break it into smaller pieces and release the nutrients. So like that safe without the combination, bacteria is the combination to unlock those nutrients. And then we also think about creating soil as coming from weathering, from erosion, and from freezing and thawing and rocks hitting other rocks, but biology has a huge play in this as well. So bacteria is really able to break it down. So as bacteria gets to work and starts breaking down slowly, now it's creating conditions where some life can live. So like lichens. And now as lichens come in on the scene, now fungus can come on the scene because fungus can actually decompose lichens. And so then it introduces more and more life as you go on. And so then we get to this one fungus per every 10 to 75 bacteria zone. And that's where we're in, which I'm going to now change my language of weeds to pioneer species. And so these are the ones that can live in these harsh conditions and like to take up nitrate. And so there's no really good or bad with nitrate or ammonium. It's just a different way of taking up the nitrogen. So those pioneer plants can handle the nitrate. There are also plants, some crops, so brassicas, if you are a brassica farmer, you want to have a more bacterial dominated soil because brassicas prefer nitrate, more nitrate than ammonium. But also if you have a certain pioneer plant that you consider a weed that you're trying to get rid of, then you want to probably increase your fungal ratio and get more towards the grasses and perennials. So that's generally where most of our desired crops fall in the 1 fungus to 1 bacterial ratio. So having that even ratio is very helpful, and then also helps self-select and helps you not have to deal with weeds. So now this is natural not needing herbicides. So you are controlling your weeds by controlling your soil, by upping your microbial content in your soil. And then as you move up and things get more mature, as you get to the mature forests all the way at the end, you can have up to 1,000 fungus to every 1 bacteria. So huge swing there. And then, so then up at the top again, nitrate is the dominant nitrogen source up until you get to an even fungal bacteria. ratio. And then beyond that is more ammonium. Yes, question.
So looking at your chart that you have here,
Mhm.
can we make assumptions here about pH or generalizations?
Yeah, so the question was, can you make assumptions about pH based on the chart here? So yeah, which is more acidic?
Far right.
Yeah, so then you would have acidic be the far right in the forests. Okay, this part is really cool. So you have your plants doing photosynthesis and making their energy, making their own food, a miracle in itself. But what is really cool is that here in this like yellowish chart is the percent of energy fixed in roots. So out of all of that energy and food that the plant is making, they're sending a bunch to the roots. And so as you work your way up and we get to trees and shrubs, they're sending up to 80% of their energy to their roots. And you would think that they would be using that energy to make more roots and spread further and stronger roots, but they can actually give up to 50% of that energy away. And they're giving it away to the microbes. So when we're farming plants, plants are actually farming microbes. So look at what they do. They are like little bakers and they wanted to make treats for the microbes, and the treats have sugar, a little bit of protein, and some carbohydrates in them. So if you baked something with those three major groups, you might make something like a cake. So the plant knows that it has a certain nutrient that it needs. And so the soil pH might be a little bit off where it's too acidic for a certain nutrient to be available. It's there, but it needs more alkaline for the nutrient to be released. So in order to do that, it lures bacteria close by. And now the bacteria gets fed with the root exudates or the cake. And now the bacteria is there pooping its alkaline poo glue, changing the pH on just a micro level on the roots, changing it so much that the nutrient is now available because it has changed the pH and made the pH allow the nutrient to be available. On another area, it might need to attract fungus. And so it cooks up another recipe that it knows the fungus likes, draws the fungus near. Now the fungus is there. And then, so on a micro level, the fungus has its acidic poo glue, changes the pH just in that little area by the root tip. And now that nutrient is available. So this plant is able to change soil chemistry on its own with using the microbes. Mind blowing, right? Yeah. Okay. So then it's attracting bacteria and fungus. And then what happens when you have attracted a bacteria or a Pac-Man very close to your roots? What else do you think might come to your roots when you have a Pac-Man there? Protozoa. Yes, so the little Pac-Man ghost is going to come eat the Pac-Man right by the roots and then poop out the ammonium right by the roots, right where that plant can get it and take it up super quickly. So remember that bacteria is super fast and efficient at locking up that nitrogen. But if the plant gets the protozoa to eat the bacteria right at its roots, the plant has a really good chance of taking that up first. Okay. So a couple other really cool relationships going on, mycorrhizal fungi. This, I feel like people really know what's going on with mycorrhizal fungi now because there's been a lot of research. It's amazing. But just one of the cool functions is that it's kind of like the Uber Eats driver of the microbe world, where you can order up the nutrient you need as a plant, and then it goes out and gets it, and then you tip it with some root exudates. And so it's pretty amazing. Another really cool relationship is nitrogen fixing bacteria. And this is like a landlord-tenant situation where the bacteria gets a cozy little apartment in a root nodule in a root. And in exchange, the nitrogen or the bacteria then fixes atmospheric nitrogen and turns it into plant available nitrogen in the soil. So that's literally like taking nitrogen out of thin air in a special Pac-Man level where you can have all the dots that you want. So they are really great for the nitrogen cycle. Another really important thing to mention too is that we talked about microbes, but the larger animals are important too. So insects and birds and mammals, they act as taxi cabs for our microbes. Microbes are tiny, they cannot cover a lot of distance, but they can if they're riding on a bird or an animal or an insect. So really having a lot of that biodiversity in our yard is important for getting all the microbes around. Another very important thing is that microbes act as like a force field for your plants. So you have your good microbes versus your bad microbes. And the easiest way to determine which one is which is generally if you have a good amount of oxygen, you're going to foster good guys. So aerobic conditions foster the good microbes. Anaerobic conditions that don't have oxygen, doesn't have oxygen fosters the bad ones. And generally bad ones tend to smell. So if you smell gross smells, you probably have an anaerobic condition breeding bad microbes. So imagine you are a seed in really good microbial rich soil and you are germinating, and now as your plant parts are growing, so are the microbes on you. They're reproducing and covering all of your plant parts, so that you now have so many good microorganisms covering you that the bad microorganisms can't come in. There's no room at the end. So it's really just a battle. And when you have so many good ones, the bad ones can't come in. It's also really amazing that with so many good microorganisms in the soil, freeing up all the nutrients that the plant needs, it makes that plant so healthy that bugs don't want to eat the plant anymore. It's so nutrient rich that it doesn't taste delicious to a bug anymore, and it moves on to your neighbor's crops who are using synthetic chemicals with weaker plants. So now we don't need bags of amendments, we don't need bags of sulfur or lime, and now we don't need bags of pesticides, of fungicides, because the microbes are doing all the work that the chemicals would do. So here's some ways to support your microbes. One, don't use chemicals. They will do everything for you. Using chemicals kills your microbes. The salts and synthetic fertilizers and chemicals kills the microbes. And now you've just killed your free workers. Tilling the soil, we see what the tractor tornado does. We want to really foster microbe communities underneath our soil. We want to compost. Composting is inoculating your soil with the good microbes. All the things that you are putting into the compost pile are covered with good microbes. You're inoculating that whole pile, and then you're putting that out into your soil, and now your soil has the microbes in it. So if you have depleted soils, this is how you get it back. Biodiversity, super important. You want to think about a very diverse range of plants, of attracting different animals. Think about every single type of different animal that you attract to your land and the microbes that are in the poop of that animal. Now you've really inoculated even more microbes. So lots that we can do. And so now that you know about some of the very, very important jobs about that microorganisms do, I hope that you guys will support them and that you will be ready to sign on trillions of free workers that want to do the hard labor for you, so that really all that is left for you to do is just futz. So thank you. And so if you have, I think I'm out of time, but if you have some questions, please take down my contact information. I love talking about this stuff. If you can't tell, I used to be a middle school and high school teacher for a while, and I love talking about soil and plants and all of this. So please let me know. And that is all I got.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So go. So next up, So we'll probably have to have you kind of help relay any discussion. I'm not sure how that's going to work quite with our virtual attendees. Hopefully Bev can also help us maybe relay what's coming across any Q&A or chat items. Next, we have Dr. James Allen. He is a professor with the School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University and has served as its executive director from 2007 to 2021. He is a founding member and immediate past chair of the Southwest Agroforestry Action Network. Dr. Allen's interest in agroforestry and agroforestry and food forests dates to his work as a Peace Corps engineer in Swaziland. His involvement in agroforestry in the Southwest began in 2017 when he took a sabbatical and spent part of it investigating current practices in the region. Jim will provide some closing thoughts from our morning session.
All right, well, thank you, Steve. So I jotted down a lot of notes, and I'm just going to try to extract a few main points from those. And I'm going to try to do it quickly enough that maybe there'll be a time for a little discussion or other kind of summarizing points that some folks want to make. I would say that first I'll let the folks online have that opportunity, because hopefully all of you will be joining us for lunch and have a chance to network there. But first I wanted to start with a few thank yous. First of all, we wouldn't have this group in this room. We wouldn't have you folks who are online if it wasn't for a number of folks. We've already acknowledged Steve Price, who was absolutely vital for making this venue possible, for doing so much of the organizing. But there was an organizing committee as well that involved Andy Mason, who you've seen a little bit of today, Mick O'Neill, who's online, Donna Davis, who's over here from Colorado Forestry Service. And then there's this kind of voice behind the curtain that we've heard a few times, and that's Beverly Babb from Arizona Community Tree Council, who's just been absolutely a very critical person behind the scenes and helping to organize this conference and help with the registration process, help with the IT process as well. So she's been incredibly valuable. And then we've had some support right from the beginning. It kind of was hinted at by Rich, but NAC, the National Agroforestry Center, has provided some support in various ways that have really helped Swan flourish. And then I want to thank the speakers for a fascinating morning, and for the speakers yet to come and the ones tomorrow. It's been a very, very interesting meeting so far. And I also wanted to mention a little bit about Swan. I mean, we've heard a little bit about Swan, but I wanted to remind you of the mission. And if you haven't, maybe take a look at the poster back here that kind of outlines some of our goals and our key mission. Having meetings like this, bringing a diverse group of people together, that's really one of the central things that we want to accomplish as a group. And it's really exciting to see that happening here today. One of the things that came up that Rich mentioned was questions for the working groups. He talked about some of the other working groups and how they flourish or don't flourish to various degrees. And he presented a slide that I think we need to revisit on Thursday, which is questions for a group like ours in terms of our mission, in terms of our goal, in terms of how we keep a group like this together. And so that was some good advice. And then another thing that was kind of a tidbit from your presentation, Will, you mentioned the Joint Chiefs program. And a lot of those other programs you brought up and that Rich brought up, those are kind of these day-to-day programs that we all need to be aware of, and we need to make sure that our practitioner colleagues are aware of. But I was thinking of that Joint Chiefs one in the context of what we'll be talking about with this global evergreening alliance, and maybe that big picture thing that we're going to talk about in the business meeting, maybe that's the kind of thing where the Joint Chiefs thing would fit. So having you all come with your ideas, we need to start putting these together and thinking about ways that we can synthesize this information and actually start to make use of it. For agroforestry to work anywhere, but for it to work in the Southwest, we need the kinds of people who are in this room. We need agency people, we need extension people, we need NGO people, and we need teachers. We need all kinds of different people. It's just exciting to see these kind of folks coming together. We need the new ideas that are being brought. I think we also need sort of a constructive sort of skepticism or rethinking of what we're hearing, and just bringing people with different perspectives together, I think, is incredibly valuable in that regard. And then just to highlight a couple other things that were from the different talks. For example, starting chronologically with Rich's, we had a great introduction to agroforestry, but then starting with you, Rich, we need to engage in policy. We need to be active in that arena more so than I think we have been. I think that's a potential role for SWAN and a potential role for some of us as individuals in our differing capacities that we have. We need to become more aware. We got a, kind of a good introduction to these ranges of programs, NRCS programs, some of the things that NAC is offering. We need to be aware of those, and we need to take the time to learn about them. We need to understand who's eligible and who's not, and those kinds of things that we heard about today, I think are really important. Then Will, you kicked off your talk with this idea of a paradigm shift, and you mentioned it more specifically in the context of soil health. And we heard a lot more about soil health in our last talk as well. And I think agroforestry is kind of a paradigm shift. I mean, in some ways it's an ancient thing, right? I mean, people have been doing it for eons, but in the production agricultural world, I think it's a paradigm shift, and we need to recognize that and to be promoters of that. To some degree, you can look at it as a paradigm reshift because of things like what Kat Thompson mentioned, you know, that it is an indigenous practice as well. We need to relearn some of the lessons, bring that common sense that you mentioned, Kelly. We need to think about some of these concepts that maybe have, you know, declined over time. Like reciprocity, for example, that Kat Thompson mentioned, this idea of reciprocal relationships between man and nature that I think agroforestry, you know, fits in really, really well. And you also mentioned, you know, I asked you about challenges or opportunities, and you brought up a challenge, which is a really important one, which is water. We heard from Kat that there are some practices that are indigenous practices that maybe are solutions. One thing I would encourage you to do as well, first of all, watch her video that she mentioned, Pope. It's a really cool video, but it brought to mind another video that's bringing up really creative water related solutions. And that is a video, it's actually a TED Talk called Planting the Rain by a guy named Brad Lancaster. Some of you probably have heard that name. But it brings up some really innovative practices that work in both rural and urban settings related to water. And we need to take these challenges on head on. You know, I hear this all the time, you know, why are you planting trees here in the Southwest? We need every drop of water. Well, we need every drop of water for constructive, productive ways to use it. And I can't think of much better way than agricultural practices like agroforestry, food forests, you name it. There are a few things in Kat's talk that I really liked. You know, she talked about the landscape as our grocery store, and partly I want to encourage us to take that sort of landscape perspective and look at the landscape as a whole as what we're managing. If you read much about traditional ecological knowledge, for example, you'll encounter this term cultural landscape and how the whole landscape was actually managed more than we understood it to be in the past. And we need to get back to really thinking about that. We need to think about some of those practices that went along with it, like planting the water first, collecting organic matter by trapping sediments, moving down slope with that organic matter in it. Another thing that came up, first in Rich's presentation, he mentioned watershed associations as being one of these potential partners. And I teach a course in watershed restoration. And so I was very happy to hear that. Kat revisited the idea of watersheds. And I think agroforestry and watershed management, watershed restoration all go incredibly hand in hand. I mean, some practices are obvious, like riparian buffers as a watershed restoration or management tool, but we need to think more broadly even than that in terms of the watersheds we live in and how agroforestry can fit into that. Kat also mentioned, it came up otherwise as well, that restoration, climate change, food security, agroforestry, they all go incredibly hand in hand, and we need to think about it that way. And then it was nice to see that you hung on to every word that your professor said as a professor. I wish all my students did that. Some do, of course. But anyway, it was a really fascinating morning, and I think got us off to a really great start in this meeting. I hope you in the audience will take full advantage and engage with the speakers that you heard from today, and vice versa. This is about networking. It's about learning, but it's also about that ultimate goal of adoption. And we hope that more and more we'll see on the landscape some of these agroforestry practices. As challenging as it is in this region, I do think it really is possible. So let me leave it at that and see if there's any sort of burning other summary points or questions. And like I said, maybe start with the folks who are online. I don't know if you've been monitoring the questions or not, Steve or Andy.
Right until my computer died, I was doing an awful job of it. But you could always open the chat up there and see
Denise
what we got.
Denise just popped.
So, there's that question from Denise. Would Kelly like to make a cartoon of like in soil for elementary school? Life in soil. Yes. That's where it needs to start, right? With the kids and with the young people. And one thing that's really nice, by the way, is how many young folks are here in the audience today that have, some of you are the future of agroforestry, of sustainable agriculture. And it's just great to see you in here. And let me put in a plug while you're here. I mentioned some names like Andy Mason, Donna Davis, Mick O'Neill. That is practically Swan. Steve, there's a bigger mailing list, but in terms of the people that are, really managing Swan, keeping it going, it's a pretty small group. We need more people. We need more diverse people. We need young people. And we'd love to see some of you who are here in person or online, become a little bit more involved with our group. I think it has the potential to have a real impact in this region. So, yes.
And just thinking about the carbon sequestration potential of agroforestry, has your group, I'm new to this group, ever connected with USDA climate hubs or the climate adaptation science centers to help with promotion and building your network?
Well, only lightly. We have been involved with the Climate Science Center that's based in Las Cruces a little bit. We've had some support and work and coordination with them. I think there's a whole lot more we can do because agroforestry certainly has the potential to sequester a lot of carbon. Urban agroforestry has the potential to be an incredible climate mitigation tool for addressing things like the heat island effect. So agroforestry has a lot to contribute to mitigating and adapting to climate, both to help mitigate the effects as well as to help adapt to the changes that are happening. And so we're somewhat aware of that, but there's much more that can be done.
Well, just to add to that, Rich, the Agroforestry Center has done quite a bit of work on carbon storage in soil, windbreaks, right? The work that Michelle did for years and years.
Yeah, there are more and more folks looking at soil carbon relationships when you have the diverse plant communities.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and we're not the only ones, but it's out there. It's a matter of putting together and sharing in a way that helps people make sense of what it looks like on their place.
That kind of reminded me of one point I wanted to make related to you, Kelly, and that is Kelly helped design a food forest that we're now implementing at a place called Arco Santi, south of Flagstaff, halfway between there and Phoenix. And it's only gone through one growing season, but you can see differences in the soil already. It's coming to life. It's really amazing how much organic matter is there already compared to what was there before and how much you're seeing organisms in that soil. It's remarkable just how fast that's happening. And, you know, that's carbon that's being built up, that's life that's being built up in the soil, just really, really fast. So anyway, I think we're at time, right?
You don't stand between this and lunch.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so thank you everyone online.
We have one question in the Q&A from Chris.
So on the topic of landscape scale thinking, how would the group characterize the state of the art of visioning diverse agricultural production to feed city scale populations in the Southwest? What are the gaps? How might we close them?
Sounds like a long discussion over lunch and then.
That's a big, I mean, ultimately that is a big portion of what we're trying to address. I don't know if anybody has any good parting thoughts, but those are our big questions. And we will have, for those online attendees, our last kind of group presentation or time together before we break for the evening. We will have some time for discussion. So maybe that's a good time to tackle some of that. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. I think that'll be a great idea because this really is a very broad question with not a quick answer before lunch. So
that could be yeah, give us some time to talk through some of it.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
All right, sounds good. Well, then we'll just put a pause on our recording and we'll see you all after lunch.